There are moments in history when the past reaches through time and touches us, not through grand monuments or celebrated artifacts, but through something small, forgotten, hidden in places no one thinks to look. This is the story of one such moment, a discovery that would unravel centuries of silence and reveal a truth carefully erased from memory. Austria, late autumn, 2019. The Hartmann estate sits on the outskirts of a village whose name most maps have forgotten. The house itself seems to exhale history 300 years of weathered stone, timber beams darkened by age, windows that reflect nothing but the grey November sky. Inside, the air tastes of dust and departed lives. Maria Volkner doesn't expect to find anything remarkable. She's cleared dozens of estates like this one, sorting through the accumulated debris of generations. Furniture worth salvaging, documents for the archives, everything else destined for disposal. It's repetitive work, but honest. She climbs the narrow stairs to the attic, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. The attic is a museum of abandonment. Trunks overflow with moth-eaten clothes, paintings lean against walls, their subjects staring from cracked canvases. Boxes of letters tied with ribbon that crumbles at the touch. Maria moves methodically through the chaos, cataloguing, deciding. Then sunlight shifts through a gap in the roof tiles, and something catches her eye. Behind a stack of forgotten books, partially hidden by a rotting curtain, sits a wooden trunk. Not unusual, she's opened hundreds. But this one feels different. The wood is dark, almost black with age. The lock is broken, the lid slightly ajar. Maria pulls the curtain aside completely, and dust motes dance in the sudden light. Inside the trunk, wrapped in what was once velvet but has degraded to mere threads, lies an object she cannot immediately identify. It's wooden, curved, hollowed like a flute, but wrong somehow. Too complex, too deliberate. She lifts it carefully. The wood is surprisingly warm, as if it's been sitting in sunlight, though the attic is cold. The surface is covered in carvings, not decorative flourishes but symbols, precise and intricate, running the length of the instrument in patterns that suggest meaning she cannot read. The wood itself is unusual grain patterns that spiral and intersect in ways she's never seen. There are holes for fingers, yes, but positioned strangely, asymmetrically. The mouthpiece seems simultaneously too large and too small. Maria has worked with museum curators long enough to recognize when something matters. This is not a toy, not a simple folk instrument. This is something crafted with purpose, with knowledge, with intention that reaches across centuries. She photographs it from every angle. The camera flash illuminating symbols that seem to shift in the changing light. Later, she'll remember this moment as the one that changed everything. The moment she held something that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, according to everything historians claim to know. But for now, she simply wraps it carefully, closes the trunk, and makes a phone call that will set extraordinary events in motion. Dr. Helena Richter has devoted 32 years to understanding musical instruments. Her office at Vienna's Institute of Ethnomusicology is a cabinet of curiosities. Medieval lutes hang on walls beside African thumb pianos. Asian wind instruments rest in cases next to pre-Columbian drums. She can identify the origin, age, and playing technique of nearly any instrument placed before her within minutes. She has written 7 books. She has consulted for museums across 3 continents. So, when Maria Volkner unwraps the object on her desk, Helena expects another routine identification. Perhaps a rare flute, possibly a valuable find, certainly interesting. What she doesn't expect is to feel her confidence, built over 3 decades, begin to crack. She picks up the instrument already, she's calling it that, though she doesn't yet know what kind, and turns it in the morning light streaming through her window. The wood should feel dry after centuries, brittle even, but instead there's an almost living quality to it, as if moisture still moves through ancient grain. She examines the symbols first. They're not decorative. They're deliberate, systematic, repeated in variations that suggest language or mathematical notation. She pulls down reference books, compares the symbols to known medieval alphabets, German, Latin, Runic. Nothing matches. She photographs them, sends images to colleagues who specialize in ancient scripts. Their responses come back confused, contradictory. One suggests Aramaic influence, another sees similarities to alchemical symbols. A third claims they resemble nothing in the historical record. The construction itself becomes increasingly troubling as she examines it more closely. Carbon dating of a small wood sample returns results that make her request a second test, certain the laboratory made an error. They didn't. The wood is approximately 800 years old, give or take 50 years. But instruments from that period don't survive in this condition. Wood degrades, warps, splits. This shows none of that deterioration. She measures the bore, the internal hollow channel that gives wind instruments their voice. The diameter changes in ways that violate traditional instrument-making principles. Tone holes are positioned where physics suggests they shouldn't work, where fingering would be awkward, where no logical acoustic purpose exists. Yet, when she looks closer, calculates the ratios between hole positions, a pattern emerges, mathematical, precise. Based on proportions that wouldn't be formally understood until the Renaissance, centuries after this instrument was apparently created. Helena contacts colleagues. A luthier in Prague, who has restored medieval instruments for 40 years, examines the photographs and admits he's never encountered this design. A museum curator in London, who specializes in rare winds, suggests it might be a modern forgery, except the carbon dating makes that impossible. A professor emeritus, who literally wrote the textbook on medieval European instruments, has no explanation. 3 weeks into her examination, Helena records a video note to herself, something she does when findings trouble her enough that she wants her thought process documented. Her voice on the recording sounds uncertain, almost anxious emotions she rarely experiences professionally. She describes how every test yields results that contradict conventional understanding, how the instrument seems to exist outside the taxonomy of known musical traditions, how its sophistication suggests knowledge that shouldn't have existed in the 13th century. The video ends with a statement that will prove prophetic. Either this is an elaborate forgery, sophisticated enough to fool every dating method we possess, or we're looking at evidence of a musical tradition that was so completely erased from history that even specialists have no record of its existence. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more. When conventional methods fail, historians turn to primary sources, the handwritten records, ledgers, and letters that capture history as it happened, unfiltered by later interpretation. Marcus Chen specializes in this kind of archaeological excavation through paper and ink. He's a research assistant with an unusual talent for finding needles in documentary haystacks, for spotting the significant detail others overlook. Helena sends him into the archives with a simple mandate: find anything, anywhere, that might explain this instrument. It's the kind of open-ended research that could take years and yield nothing. But Marcus is patient. He understands that history hides its secrets in margins and footnotes, in the throwaway lines scribes added when they thought no one important was watching. He begins with collections in Vienna, working through monastic libraries where medieval monks copied texts and occasionally added their own observations. The work is painstaking. Most documents have nothing to do with music. Trade agreements, property disputes, theological arguments, the mundane machinery of medieval life. But every few hundred pages, something emerges. A merchant's ledger from 1289, noting expenses for a journey through Bavaria, includes one cryptic line: paid to the maker of peculiar melody 2 silver marks for passage rights. Peculiar melody. Not a song, not a performance, but melody itself described as peculiar, as if the sound was the thing being purchased, not the service of a musician. 3 weeks later, in a different archive, Marcus finds a bishop's travel diary from 1347. Most entries describe administrative matters: inspections of parishes, meetings with local nobility, concerns about church maintenance. Then, for a single day in September, the tone changes. The bishop describes passing through a remote village and hearing music unlike any sanctioned by Holy Church, possessed of qualities that unsettled the spirit and caused the mind to wander into unwholesome contemplation. The entry ends abruptly, as if the bishop decided he'd written too much and stopped himself. The pattern emerges slowly. References are always oblique, always nervous. A tax record from Prague mentions payments to practitioners of shadow melodies. A banned text from the Inquisition Marcus finds it in a restricted collection after considerable bureaucratic negotiation references. Instruments of enchantment that bewitch through sound rather than word, and thus fall outside the jurisdiction of spoken heresy, yet must be condemned nonetheless. Most significant is what Marcus finds in a monastery near Salzburg. A manuscript about church music theory, copied around 1370, includes marginalia notes written in the empty spaces around the formal text. Whoever owned this book made small drawings, symbols that match exactly the carvings on Helena's instrument. Next to the symbols in cramped Latin, someone has written, "These are the marks of the Forbidden Guild. Do not speak their name. Do not seek their works. They were righteously destroyed." Marcus photographs everything, cross-references, dates and locations, builds a timeline. The earliest mention he can find dates to 1186. The latest is from 1378, then nothing. Complete silence. Whatever these instruments were, whatever tradition they represented, it vanished from the historical record in the late 14th century, as if it had never existed. But the way it vanished troubles Marcus. History doesn't usually erase things this thoroughly through accident. When traditions fade naturally, they leave traces, descendants who remember fragments, objects that survive in attics and basements, gradual references declining over generations. This is different. This is systematic removal. References don't taper off, they stop. One year there are records of payments, mentions in diaries, warnings in church documents. The next year, silence. He finds one final document that makes his hands shake as he photographs it. A letter from a bishop to the papal authorities in Avignon, dated 1377. It requests guidance on the matter of the shadow song practitioners who persist in their arts despite our pronouncements. The response, attached, is brief and absolute. Proceed with full authority, eradicate the practice entire, burn their devices, silence their heresies, let no trace remain. Someone, Marcus realizes, wanted this music forgotten, not just discouraged or discouraged, erased, and they very nearly succeeded. To understand why an instrument would be systematically destroyed, you must first understand what music meant to the medieval mind. We think of music as entertainment, as art, as emotional expression. They thought of it as power literal, tangible, capable of reshaping reality itself. The idea originates with Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician who discovered that harmonious sounds correspond to simple mathematical ratios. But he didn't stop at observation. Pythagoras claimed the cosmos itself was mathematical, that celestial bodies moved in patterns producing perfect harmonies, the music of the spheres. Earthly music, in this framework, either aligned with cosmic harmony or disrupted it. Every note had moral weight. Every melody could heal or harm. Medieval Europe inherited these beliefs and amplified them through Christian theology. The Church taught that God created the universe through divine proportion, and music that reflected this proportion was holy, while music that violated it was dangerous. This wasn't metaphor. They believed certain sounds could literally open doorways to heaven if you played the right notes, to other places if you didn't. The Church therefore controlled music with the same intensity it controlled theology. Specific scales were approved for worship, the 8 church modes, each with prescribed emotional and spiritual effects. Composers worked within rigid frameworks, their creativity constrained by doctrine, but constraint also defined forbidden territory. If certain sounds were holy, others were unholy. If harmony pleased God, disharmony might summon what displeased him. The tritone, an interval spanning 3 whole tones, earned the nickname diabolus in musica, the devil in music. Play those 2 notes together, and medieval ears heard wrongness, instability, a sound that pulled at the soul's fabric. Music theory texts warned against it. Composers avoided it. The few who used it deliberately, for dramatic effect, did so with careful preparation and quick resolution, as if the interval couldn't be sustained without spiritual risk. But the tritone was only the most notorious example. The Church maintained extensive lists of forbidden intervals, prohibited rhythms, unsanctioned scales. Musicians who violated these rules faced consequences, ranging from public penance to accusations of heresy. Because heresy wasn't about belief alone, it manifested through action. You could think wrong thoughts in private, but the moment you gave them voice, or in this case, you gave them sound, you endangered not just yourself, but everyone who heard. Instruments themselves carried moral classification. Organs and bells were holy, their sounds appropriate for sacred spaces. They were large, expensive, controlled by church authorities. But drums, reed instruments, stringed instruments, played in taverns, these were suspect. They accompanied dancing, physical pleasure, states of abandon that the church viewed as spiritually dangerous. The body was a battleground between soul and flesh, and music that moved the body was ammunition for the wrong side. Against this backdrop, imagine an instrument designed deliberately to produce sounds outside the approved vocabulary. Not accidentally wrong, not folk music operating in ignorance, but sophisticated construction aimed at creating sonic effects the church had forbidden. That's not a musical choice. It's a declaration of theological independence. It's claiming the right to explore consciousness through sound without ecclesiastical permission. The medieval world understood something we've forgotten. Sound is not neutral. It doesn't just carry information. It affects the listener physiologically, neurologically, psychologically. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what medieval theorists intuited: certain frequencies alter brainwaves, induce trance states, facilitate emotional release, change how we perceive reality. The church wasn't wrong to believe music had power. They were accurate. Where they erred was in believing they could monopolize that power, could control which sounds were permissible and which endangered the social order they'd constructed. The instrument, Helena examines, with its unusual construction and forbidden intervals, represents something genuinely threatening to medieval authorities. Not a minor heresy, not a folk tradition operating harmlessly on the margins. This was technology, sonic technology, designed to alter consciousness, to facilitate experiences the church claimed only happened through their sanctioned sacraments. Whoever built it wasn't just making music. They were building doorways, and they weren't asking permission about where those doorways led. Deep in the Pyrenees Mountains, far from the reach of bishops and the oversight of church authorities, the Cathars developed a form of Christianity that Rome declared heretical. They believed the material world was created by an evil demiurge, that salvation meant escaping physical existence, that direct experience of the divine was possible without priests or sacraments, and they believed music could facilitate that experience. What the Cathars practiced survives only in the horrified descriptions of those who destroyed them. Inquisitors, documenting heresies before executing heretics, described gatherings where Cathars would sing for hours in complex polyphony, multiple voices weaving together in patterns that allegedly produced visions. Not symbolic visions, not religious ecstasy in the conventional sense, but actual visual phenomena. One inquisitor describes participants seeing colors that have no names in human speech, geometries that hurt to contemplate, light that seemed to originate from within rather than without. The Cathars weren't alone. Throughout medieval Europe, mystery schools operated in the spaces between official religion and folk practice. Hermetic traditions inherited from Egypt and Greece, Gnostic communities following ancient Christian variants, alchemists seeking transformation through carefully orchestrated processes. All of them used sound as technology. They understood that consciousness isn't fixed but fluid, that the right acoustic environment can shift perception into territories the waking mind normally excludes. Consider how universal this knowledge is across cultures. Siberian shamans use repetitive drumming at specific tempos to journey into non-ordinary reality. Sufi mystics whirl and chant, inducing ecstatic states they describe as direct union with the divine. Buddhist monks discover that chanting specific syllables produces physical sensations and mental clarity beyond normal meditation. Indigenous traditions worldwide use rattles, flutes, and voice to alter consciousness for healing, divination, and communication with what they understand as spirit worlds. Medieval Europe possessed its own versions of these practices, but we've lost most of them because the church systematically destroyed them. What survives are fragments, glimpses, the testimonies of inquisitors who documented what they destroyed. and those testimonies are remarkable for their specificity. They don't describe vague mystical experiences. They describe precise techniques, singing in particular intervals, layering voices in specific mathematical relationships, maintaining continuous sound for measured durations. One account, from the trial of a Cathar perfecti, their spiritual elite, describes how the accused demonstrated their practice under duress, perhaps believing it would prove they threatened no one. The Inquisitor records that the heretic sang a melody containing 7 distinct sections, each corresponding to a spiritual state, and as he progressed from section to section, those present felt themselves drawn upward through gradations of consciousness until at the 7th section, several witnesses claimed to perceive the room filling with light, though no lamps had been lit. The Church's response was brutal and total. The Albigensian Crusade slaughtered thousands of Cathars between 1209 and 1229. But killing people wasn't enough. Authorities issued specific instructions for destroying their musical instruments, burning their notation systems, eliminating anyone who possessed knowledge of their practices. This wasn't about silencing dissent. This was about erasing a technology. Why such extreme measures? Because the Cathar approach threatened the Church's central claim, that spiritual experience required priestly mediation. If individuals could access non-ordinary states of consciousness directly through sound, what did they need priests for? If music could produce the visions and insights the Church said came only through sanctioned sacraments, the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy became unnecessary. The Cathars weren't just offering alternative theology. They were providing alternative technology that made official religion optional. The instrument Helena examines shares key features with descriptions of Cathar musical practices. The complex overtone patterns it produces, the way it combines frequencies to create beating rhythms that entrain brainwaves, the deliberately unusual construction that rejects conventional design. All of this suggests it was built by people who understood sound's consciousness-altering properties and deliberately optimized for those effects. This wasn't an accident of craftsmanship. This was engineering. Someone knew exactly what they were creating and why, and someone else knew exactly why it had to be destroyed. Modern acoustics provides vocabulary for phenomena medieval musicians discovered empirically. When Dr. Yuki Tanaka examines the instrument using 21st century technology, she's measuring what medieval craftspeople intuited through centuries of careful experimentation. But the results still astonish her. She begins with basic acoustic analysis, measuring how sound moves through the instrument's chambers, how the bore shape affects tone production, how air pressure translates into vibration. What she discovers is sophistication that shouldn't exist in a 13th century artifact. The bore isn't cylindrical or conical, the standard shapes that produce predictable acoustic results. Instead, it varies in complex curves, widening and narrowing in patterns that serve no obvious purpose until she maps them mathematically. The pattern emerges in the data. The bore shape is designed to emphasize specific overtones while suppressing others. Every instrument produces overtones, harmonics that resonate above the fundamental frequency. Usually, these follow natural harmonic series based on simple mathematical relationships. But this instrument breaks those rules. Its bore shape filters the overtone series, removing some harmonics, while amplifying others in ways that create unusual timbral effects. More striking is what happens when 2 notes are played in sequence. Computer modeling shows the instrument produces beating patterns, interference waves created when 2 similar frequencies interact. These aren't accidental byproducts of poor tuning. They're engineered into the design. The tone holes are positioned so that specific note combinations produce beats at precise frequencies between 4 and 7 Hz. This is where medieval craftsmanship and modern neuroscience converge. Theta brainwaves, the slow oscillations associated with deep meditation, trance states, and the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness occur at 4 to 7 Hz. The instrument is designed to produce acoustic beating patterns that match theta frequencies. Play it correctly, and you're not just making music. You're broadcasting a signal that encourages listeners' brains to synchronize with theta rhythms. This isn't speculation. When Tanaka plays recordings of the instrument to test subjects while monitoring their brain activity with EEG, she documents measurable entrainment. Within 3 minutes of listening, subjects' brainwaves begin shifting toward theta dominance. After 10 minutes, Many enter light trance states still conscious and aware, but reporting altered perception, time distortion, enhanced visual imagination. After 20 minutes, some subjects show brainwave patterns similar to deep meditation practitioners, though they have no meditation training. The most remarkable discovery involves frequency relationships. Tanaka identifies that certain note combinations produce sum and difference tones, additional pitches, the ear perceives from the interaction of two sounded notes. Renaissance theorists eventually documented this phenomenon, but this instrument exploits it deliberately. Specific fingerings generate difference tones in the subsonic range below 20 Hz, below conscious hearing, but still perceived by the body as vibration, as pressure, as something felt rather than heard. These subsonic components have documented effects on human physiology. They can induce anxiety or, paradoxically, profound relaxation, depending on their character and context. They can create sensations of spatial expansion, of presence, of being touched by something invisible. Military researchers have explored infrasound as a weapon because it affects people at subconscious levels, bypassing rational processing. Medieval instrument makers obviously didn't have access to EEG machines or spectrum analyzers, but they had something equally valuable: time, patience, and direct observation across generations. If an instrument design consistently produced trance states, they kept it. If fingering positions reliably generated specific emotional effects, they codified those positions. Over centuries, through systematic trial and error, they discovered principles that wouldn't be formally understood until the 19th and 20th centuries. This raises unsettling questions about the nature of scientific knowledge. We assume progress is linear. Past people knew less, we know more. Future people will know still more. But evidence increasingly suggests that certain knowledge systems were lost rather than superseded. Medieval sound practitioners didn't have our theoretical framework, but they achieved results that modern science is only now beginning to reproduce and understand. They approach sound not as physics to be studied, but as technology to be mastered. And in that mastery, they discovered truths we're only rediscovering through our different methodologies. The instrument Helena examines isn't primitive. It's sophisticated in ways that challenge assumptions about medieval technical capability. Someone understood psychoacoustics. Someone engineered consciousness alteration through sound. Someone built a machine because that's what it is, a machine for accessing non-ordinary states of awareness. And someone else decided that machine was too dangerous to exist. The research team gathers in Helena's cluttered office on a cold January morning to address a question that's become unavoidable. Should they attempt to play the original instrument, or is the artifact too valuable to risk? What begins as a practical conservation discussion quickly becomes something deeper, a debate about responsibility, knowledge, and whether some doors should remain closed. Conservation experts argue the artifact is irreplaceable. Carbon dated to 8 centuries ago, it's the only complete example of its kind ever discovered. Playing it means stress on wood that survived through pure luck and favorable conditions. One crack, one split, and humanity loses something that can never be recovered. Better to study it through non-invasive methods, imaging technology, acoustic modeling, spectral analysis, and preserve it unplayed for future generations. But others counter that an instrument exists to make sound. Examining it in silence is like studying a painting in complete darkness, judging a sculpture by description alone. The instrument's purpose, its meaning, its value, all of these reside not in the wood itself, but in the sounds it produces. To never play it is to preserve the form while destroying the essence. That's not conservation. It's creating an elaborate coffin. The debate grows more heated, more philosophical. Dr. Richter raises a concern that silences the room. If medieval authorities feared this instrument, if they systematically destroyed every example they could find, if they went to extraordinary lengths to erase knowledge of its very existence, do we have the right to resurrect what they buried? Perhaps their suppression was justified. Perhaps there are sounds that shouldn't be heard, experiences that endanger rather than enlighten. Are we being arrogant? Assuming we're immune to whatever made it dangerous to people who understood its effects far better than we do? Marcus counters that suppression was about power, not protection. The church destroyed what it couldn't control, silenced what threatened its authority. To let their persecution succeed 8 centuries later is to validate the same impulse that burns books, bans ideas, and declares certain knowledge too dangerous for common people. Every generation thinks it can decide what the next generation should be allowed to know. Maybe instead, we should trust people to encounter this knowledge and make their own determinations. A compromise emerges from the lengthy discussion. They'll build an exact replica using period-appropriate materials and techniques. The original remains untouched in climate-controlled preservation. The replica can be played, studied, tested, without irreplaceable heritage at risk. If the replica gets damaged, they can build another. Problem solved. Except building a replica proves more complicated than anticipated. The wood must be aged correctly, not just old, but aged in specific conditions that affect grain structure and acoustic properties. The tools must be period appropriate, because modern machinery leaves different marks, creates different surfaces. The craftsperson must understand medieval techniques that weren't written down because they were trade secrets, passed master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. Finding someone willing and capable to take on the reconstruction takes 3 months. Many luthiers express interest until they see detailed specifications. Then they decline politely, citing scheduling conflicts or technical doubts. The design violates too many principles they've spent careers mastering. Building it would require them to unlearn their expertise, to trust an 800-year-old blueprint over their accumulated knowledge. That's a psychological bridge too far. Finally, Johann Kreutzer agrees. He's old enough that professional reputation matters less, curious enough that mystery attracts rather than repels. He reviews the measurements, examines the photographs, nods slowly. Yes, he can build this. But he wants it understood. He's building something he doesn't fully comprehend, something that violates his intuition about how instruments should work. If the result sounds terrible or doesn't function, he won't consider it his failure. He's a craftsman, following specifications, not a designer, validating a concept. The team agrees to his terms, relieved someone will attempt the work. None of them anticipate how the reconstruction process will affect him. Johann Kreutzer's workshop sits in a Bavarian village, where his family has built instruments for 6 generations. The space smells of wood shavings and oil, its walls hung with tools whose purposes most modern craftspeople wouldn't recognize. He works alone, preferring silence to radio or conversation. His hands, gnarled from decades of precise labor, move with certainty born from repetition counted not in hours but years. He begins by selecting wood walnut from trees that died decades ago, aged in his family's storage barns. The wood must be old enough to have stabilized, its moisture content in equilibrium with the surrounding air. He examines grain patterns, rejects pieces with knots or irregular growth. This part he knows. This part follows tradition. But as construction progresses, Johann encounters design choices that trouble him. The instrument specifies joints where they create structural weakness rather than strength. Wall thickness varies in patterns that violate acoustic principles he's relied on his entire career. Tone holes are positioned asymmetrically, breaking the symmetry that usually characterizes wind instruments. Every decision seems wrong, yet the specifications are precise, deliberate. Someone knew exactly what they wanted and why. He follows the plans, because that's what he agreed to do. Uses hide glue mixed according to medieval recipes that take 3 days to prepare. Shapes wood using only hand tools. No power sanders, no drill presses, no machinery that didn't exist in the 13th century. The work is slow, meditative, demanding. His hands remember techniques his conscious mind has half forgotten, muscle memory passed down through generations. But something changes as the instrument takes shape. Johann begins having vivid dreams, not nightmares exactly, but intensely realistic scenarios, where he's in different workshops, different times. In the dreams, hands that aren't his work on the same patterns he's carving during waking hours. The dream hands move with confidence he doesn't feel, as if whoever owned them had built dozens of these instruments before, had refined the design through extensive iteration. He wakes from these dreams with melodies in his mind. He hums them while working, doesn't realize he's doing it until his wife mentions hearing him sing songs she doesn't recognize. Songs that don't sound like anything on the radio, anything from their church, anything from their region's folk tradition. songs that somehow feel familiar despite being utterly foreign. 3 times during construction, the wood splits while sitting untouched on his workbench, not during carving or drilling, not when stress is being applied. Johann arrives at his workshop in the morning to find cracks that weren't there when he left. Always at the same locations, the places where tone holes will eventually be drilled. He repairs the splits, reinforces the structure, but privately wonders if the wood is trying to refuse the shape he's imposing on it. His wife notices he's losing weight, sleeping poorly, becoming withdrawn. She asks if the work is too stressful, if he should quit and return the commission. Johann considers it. He's 72 years old. He doesn't need the money. He could walk away with his reputation intact, let someone else finish the project. But something pulls him forward. Not obligation or professional pride. Something else. Curiosity that's become compulsion. The final assembly happens on an October evening. Johann fits the pieces together, applies final adjustments, tests the seal around the mouthpiece. According to every technical measure, the instrument is complete and should function, but holding it feels wrong in ways he struggles to articulate. The weight is right, the balance is correct, yet somehow the whole thing resists his touch, feels alien despite being made by his own hands. He calls Helena and tells her the reconstruction is finished, ready for pickup. Then he adds something he didn't plan to say, words that emerge from some intuitive place he didn't know he possessed. I've built instruments for 50 years. Flutes, oboes, recorders, things you've never heard of. This is the first time I've felt that what I built didn't want to exist. I don't know what that means, or if it means anything. But someone should know. He doesn't build another instrument after this one. Within the year, he closes his workshop and retires. When interviewed later, he declines to discuss the project in detail, saying only, "Some knowledge costs more than it pays." Leora Avshalom specializes in coaxing sound from instruments that haven't been heard in centuries. She's played reconstructed lyres from ancient Mesopotamia, medieval shawms that last sounded before the Black Death, folk instruments from extinct cultures. She approaches each with reverence and technical precision, understanding that she's not just making music but resurrecting voices time has silenced. When Helena contacts her about attempting to play the Shadow Song reconstruction, Leora agrees immediately. The mystery appeals to her, an instrument designed sophisticated enough to trouble modern experts, a tradition so thoroughly erased that even its name is lost. She reviews the acoustic analysis, studies, photographs, prepares mentally for the challenge ahead. The recording session is scheduled for early morning in an anechoic chamber, a room designed to absorb all sound reflections, creating acoustic conditions similar to open outdoor space. The team wants clean recordings without environmental interference, pure documentation of the instrument's voice. Microphones surround the space at multiple angles. EEG sensors will monitor Leora's brainwaves during playing. Everything is calibrated, tested, ready. Leora enters the chamber, carrying the reconstruction with both hands, as one might carry something precious or potentially dangerous. She's played hundreds of historical instruments, but this one affects her differently. The wood feels unusually warm despite the room's controlled temperature. The weight seems to shift subtly as she adjusts her grip, as if the instrument is settling into her hands rather than her hands learning to hold it. She examines the fingering positions one last time, calculates breath pressure based on bore diameter and resistance. Then she raises the instrument, closes her eyes, and exhales the first exploratory breath. What emerges defies simple description. Not quite flute, not quite oboe, not quite any wind instrument she's played before. The sound seems to exist in 2 places, simultaneously emanating from the instrument, but also resonating inside her skull, as if her own bones have become part of the acoustic space. She plays a simple ascending scale. Each note carries complex overtones that shimmer and pulse, creating beats between adjacent frequencies. The sound isn't pure, it's textured, layered, almost visual in its intensity. Through the glass separating the chamber from the control room, she sees the research team leaning forward. Attention absolute. She continues playing, exploring the instrument's range. The low register sounds almost human, a voice humming, wordless but expressive. The middle register sings with crystalline clarity. The high register produces sounds that seem to bypass her ears entirely, felt more than heard, like pressure changes before a storm. But something else happens that wasn't anticipated. As she plays, Leora feels time beginning to stretch. The chamber's walls seem to recede. The distinction between herself as player and the instrument being played blurs. She knows objectively that she's been playing for perhaps 3 minutes, but subjectively it feels like hours, like she's been sustaining sound forever and will continue forever. Like beginning and ending have ceased to be relevant concepts. She stops abruptly, lowers the instrument, opens her eyes to find her hands shaking slightly. The research team watches through the glass with expressions she can't quite read: concern, fascination, something else. She signals she needs a break, sets the instrument carefully on a padded stand, exits the chamber. Helena asks if she's all right. Leora nods but doesn't speak immediately. When words come, they're careful, chosen deliberately. I've played instruments from dozens of cultures and centuries. That was different. Not just sonically, though it's sonically unlike anything I've experienced, but psychologically. 3 minutes felt like both an instant and an eternity. I felt, not unsafe exactly, but like continuing would take me somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. The recording captures only 3 minutes of sound, but those 3 minutes will generate controversy, fascination, and questions that nobody can definitively answer. The instrument works. Now they need to understand what, exactly, it's designed to do. After Leora's unsettling first encounter with the instrument's sound, the investigation shifts focus. If the instrument produces measurable psychological effects, and if medieval authorities feared it enough to systematically destroy every example, then somewhere in the historical record there must be evidence of who created these instruments and why. The answer, it turns out, has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, literally in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Medieval scribes worked with expensive materials. Parchment cost more than most people earned in months. Ink required careful preparation, and every page represented significant investment. The formal texts they copied, religious treatises, legal documents, philosophical works, occupied the center of each page. But the margins belonged to the scribes themselves. There, in spaces not subject to official oversight, they drew illustrations, made personal notes, recorded information they found interesting, but which didn't fit the main text's purpose. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, a specialist in medieval marginalia, joins the research team specifically to examine manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries. She works systematically through collections across Europe, photographing margins, cataloguing symbols, building a database of recurring patterns. Most marginalia are mundane complaints about cold weather, prayers for deceased friends, crude jokes about superiors, but occasionally something else appears. In a music theory manuscript from 1267, copied in a Bavarian monastery, small symbols appear in the margin next to a discussion of church modes. The symbols match exactly those carved on Helena's instrument, not similar, identical. Whoever made those marginal notes had seen these instruments, had studied them closely enough to reproduce their markings with precision. Sarah finds the pattern repeated across dozens of manuscripts from different locations, different decades, different scribal hands. Always the symbols appear adjacent to discussions of music, sound, or harmony. Always they're small, discreet, almost deliberately inconspicuous. And always they're accompanied by the same phrase in abbreviated Latin, D.S., or sometimes D.S. The abbreviation means nothing until Marcus, searching through German guild records, finds a reference that provides context. In a tax ledger from medieval Vienna, dated 1314, payments are recorded to various guilds, smiths, tanners, weavers, all the expected trades. But one entry stands out. Masters of der Schattenklang. 40 silver marks for services rendered to the Archduke's household. Schattenklang, shadow song. The phrase appears nowhere in standard musical terminology. It doesn't describe a genre, an instrument type, or a performance style known to historians. Yet here it is, recorded officially, taxed like any legitimate trade. The guild existed. It operated openly enough to pay taxes, to serve aristocratic patrons, to maintain workshops in major cities. So why has history forgotten it so completely? Sarah and Marcus collaborate, cross-referencing marginal symbols with guild records, tax documents, and property registries. A picture emerges of a network spanning Central Europe, chapters in Prague, Vienna, Lyon, Cologne, and at least a dozen smaller cities. The guild appears to have operated between approximately 1180 and 1378, a span of nearly 2 centuries. That's not a fringe movement or temporary phenomenon. That's an established institution, successful enough to persist across multiple generations. Guild records are frustratingly vague about what exactly these practitioners did. Payments mention services without specifying details. Property records note workshops, but don't describe what occurred inside them. It's as if everyone at the time knew what Shadow Song meant, and therefore saw no need to explain it. Or perhaps the guild deliberately kept their work ambiguous, operating in plain sight while guarding their actual techniques. Then, abruptly, the records stop. Not gradually, no slow decline or references becoming sparser over time. Between 1377 and 1378, mentions of der Schattenklang vanish from historical documents across Europe simultaneously. In Vienna, the guild's property is confiscated and sold. In Prague, their workshop is demolished. In Lyon, a single cryptic note in a bishop's correspondence. The matter of shadow practitioners has been resolved according to papal instruction. Something happened in those years, something coordinated, something that reached across political boundaries to eliminate an entire profession. The research team now has proof the guild existed. What they need to understand is what the guild was destroyed for doing. Archaeological evidence provides answers that documentary records obscure. Following leads from guild property registries, the team identifies potential locations where Shadow Song practitioners maintained workshops. Most sites have been built over, their medieval structures destroyed or buried beneath centuries of subsequent construction. But one location in rural Thuringia, Germany, offers possibility. A 14th century chapel, abandoned for decades and scheduled for demolition to make way for modern development, appears in guild records as a property adjacent to a Shadow Song workshop. Ground-penetrating radar, conducted as routine archaeological assessment before demolition, reveals anomalies beneath the structure voids that shouldn't exist under a simple chapel, chambers that weren't indicated on any surviving architectural plans. Excavation begins in September, led by Dr. Franz Weber, an archaeologist who's uncovered dozens of medieval sites. He expects to find a cellar, perhaps a crypt standard features of period chapels. What he discovers instead transforms understanding of what the Shadow Song Guild actually practiced. Below the chapel's known foundation lies another level, deliberately concealed. Access was through a hidden entrance, now collapsed, that once connected to the chapel's vestry. The chamber is approximately 12 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rises to meet the chapel floor above. But this isn't a storage space or emergency refuge. Every detail of its construction suggests deliberate acoustic design. The walls are covered in carved patterns, not decorative but functional, creating a textured surface that would scatter sound waves, prevent echoes, create acoustic conditions that didn't exist naturally in medieval architecture. The floor is marked with concentric circles, 7 rings surrounding a central point. At cardinal directions around the outer circle, symbols are carved into the stone, the same symbols that appear on the instrument, in manuscript margins, in fragmentary guild records. Inside the chamber, the excavation team finds fragments, pieces of at least 7 different instruments, all deliberately broken before the space was sealed. Chemical analysis dates the destruction to the same narrow window when guild records vanish from historical documents, 1377 to 1378. Someone broke these instruments with systematic thoroughness, as if ensuring they could never be repaired or reconstructed from their remains. Among the fragments, researchers find something extraordinary. Carved tablets, flat pieces of dense hardwood covered in notational systems unlike any surviving musical notation. Standard medieval notation used neumes marks indicating pitch direction and approximate duration. These tablets use 3-dimensional diagrams, showing not just pitch and duration, but additional parameters. Scholars struggle to interpret. Lines indicate volume changes. Colors mark different timbres. Symbols surround notes, suggesting perhaps breathing patterns, perhaps emotional states, perhaps something else entirely. One researcher, examining high-resolution photographs of the tablets, suggests they might be synesthetic notations, attempts to encode multiple sensory experiences simultaneously. The composers weren't just writing down how music should sound. They were documenting complete experiences, instructions for producing specific states of consciousness through carefully orchestrated sonic environments. The chamber's layout reinforces this interpretation. The 7 concentric circles on the floor aren't arbitrary. 7 notes in a scale. 7 celestial bodies known to medieval astronomy. 7 levels of consciousness described in esoteric traditions, from Sufism to Kabbalah to Christian mysticism. The performers would stand on these circles, their positions determining acoustic relationships, creating spatial arrangements where sound from different locations would interact in specific ways. Chemical analysis of residue on the floor reveals another dimension of their practice. The team finds traces of burned herbs, mugwort, wormwood, and mandrake plants associated in medieval folk medicine with vision quests and altered consciousness. The shadow song practitioners weren't just playing music in this space. They were conducting ceremonies, creating multisensory experiences where sound combined with aromatic smoke and ritualistic positioning to facilitate profound alterations of consciousness. The evidence paints a picture of extraordinary sophistication. These weren't simple musicians or even advanced craftspeople. They were technologists, designers of experiences, engineers of consciousness, practitioners who understood that human awareness could be systematically shifted through carefully orchestrated environmental conditions. The instruments were components in a larger system, tools used within specific contexts to produce effects that apparently couldn't be achieved through sound alone. What happened in this chamber? What experiences did participants have when the system operated as designed? The destroyed instruments and sealed space suggest someone decided those experiences were too dangerous to continue. But dangerous to whom? To the participants themselves, or to the religious and political authorities whose power depended on controlling access to transcendent experiences? The workshop doesn't answer these questions definitively, but it confirms that whatever the guild was doing, it was sophisticated, systematic, and threatening enough to warrant complete elimination. The evidence converges on a specific historical moment: winter 1377 to spring 1378, when the Shadow Song Guild was systematically eliminated across Europe. This wasn't gradual decline or natural obsolescence. This was coordinated suppression, planned and executed with efficiency that could only come from high-level organization. Inquisition records, archived in Vatican collections and rarely examined by researchers outside ecclesiastical history, contain the documentation. Dr. Antonio Ricci granted rare access to these materials, photographs, pages that haven't been digitized, that exist only in their original form in climate-controlled vaults beneath Rome. What he finds is troubling not just for what it reveals, but for how casually it's documented, as if the elimination of an entire profession was routine administrative work. The records describe coordinated raids across 12 cities within a 4-month period. The language is bureaucratic, almost boring in its precision. Dates, locations, numbers of practitioners apprehended, property confiscated, instruments destroyed. But occasionally, in marginal notes or letters between bishops coordinating the operations, glimpses of motivation appear. One bishop writes to another, describing shadow song practitioners as those who claim to reach divine ecstasy through sound rather than sacrament, thereby denying the necessity of Holy Church and endangering the souls of all who hear their productions. Another letter references instruments that bewitch the mind and lead souls toward illuminations that originate not from God, but from deception. The key phrase appears repeatedly, through sound rather than sacrament. The guild's crime wasn't practicing heresy in the conventional sense, denying doctrine, questioning theology, following alternative scriptures. Their crime was providing alternative technology for accessing experiences the Church claimed required priestly mediation. They were undermining the Church's monopoly on transcendence. Historical context explains the timing. The papal schism began in 1378, when competing popes in Rome and Avignon each claimed legitimate authority. The Church was already experiencing internal crisis, paranoid about anything that could further fragment its power. Additionally, Europe was still traumatized by the Black Death, which had killed perhaps half the population a generation earlier. In that atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, anyone associated with mysterious practices became suspect, vulnerable to scapegoating. The suppression followed a pattern. Guild members were approached by church authorities and offered a choice: surrender their instruments, swear never to practice their craft again, and face no further consequences, or refuse and be prosecuted for heresy, a charge that could result in torture, imprisonment, execution, confiscation of all property, and spiritual damnation. Most chose surrender. Public ceremonies were organized in major cities where confiscated instruments were burned. These weren't merely functional destructions, but theatrical demonstrations of church power over forces it declared demonic. Chronicles from the period describe how authorities framed these burnings, not as suppression of legitimate art, but as exorcism, cleansing communities of spiritual pollution. Those who resisted faced brutal consequences. Trial records survive from Prague, describing the prosecution of 3 shadow song practitioners who refused to renounce their craft. The charges are revealing: not just practicing forbidden arts, but enabling others to experience states of consciousness outside proper ecclesiastical authority, and creating sounds that bypass rational thought and affect the soul directly, thereby opening doorways to demonic influence. They were tortured until they provided names of other practitioners, locations of hidden workshops, details about their techniques. Then they were executed, their bodies burned, their ashes scattered to prevent veneration. Their families were required to publicly denounce them and adopt new surnames to distance themselves from the taint of association. One piece of evidence survives that provides the victim's perspective: a letter, smuggled from prison by means unknown, from one condemned practitioner to family members. The parchment is fragmentary, water-damaged, barely legible. But one passage remains clear: they fear not the sound itself, but what listeners become upon hearing it. We offered doorways. They demand walls. We trusted each soul's readiness. They insist none are ready without their permission. For this we die, but the knowledge dies with us, and humanity is diminished. Within a single generation, knowledge accumulated over 2 centuries was effectively erased. Young people who might have become apprentices found no masters. Instruments that might have survived in private collections were voluntarily destroyed by families fearing persecution by association. Techniques that required hands-on demonstration, never written down because they involved subtle physical skills, vanished when the last masters died without teaching successors. The suppression succeeded almost completely. Almost. Because the instrument that Maria found in an Austrian attic proves that something survived. One complete example, preserved by someone who refused to let the tradition die entirely. The question is who and why they chose to hide rather than destroy what authorities worked so hard to eliminate. Officially, the shadow song tradition ended in 1378. Unofficially, fragments survived, preserved by individuals and small groups who recognized value in what authorities declared worthless or dangerous. This underground preservation wasn't organized. No central committee decided to save the knowledge for posterity. Instead, scattered individuals, motivated by curiosity or rebellion, or simple refusal to accept that valuable things should be destroyed because power demanded it, kept pieces alive. The trail is fragmentary, requiring detective work across multiple disciplines. Art historians notice unusual instrument designs in Renaissance paintings. Musicologists find cryptic references in composers' private letters. Historians of science discover acoustic experiments that seem to rediscover principles the Guild had known centuries earlier. None of these specialists were looking for connections to a suppressed medieval tradition, but when the evidence is assembled, patterns emerge. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks contain sketches that match shadow song design principles. Among his thousands of drawings are instruments that violate conventional acoustic logic, but which, analyzed using modern software, would produce beating patterns and overtone relationships similar to the reconstructed artifact. Next to these sketches, Leonardo writes in his characteristic mirror script, "Harmonies that alter perception more than emotion. The ancients knew this. We have forgotten." The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 1600s, mysterious documents that appeared simultaneously in multiple European cities, signed by an anonymous brotherhood claiming ancient wisdom, reference instruments of illumination among the lost knowledge they claim to possess. Modern scholars dismiss these manifestos as either hoaxes or symbolic rather than literal descriptions. But given what's now known about the Shadow Song Guild, perhaps the Rosicrucians were describing actual historical practices, preserving through coded language what couldn't be stated openly. A family of German craftsmen named Vogel built unusual instruments across 6 generations, from the 1500s through the early 1900s. Their works, now scattered among museums and private collections, were always described as historical reproductions of medieval designs. But examinations reveal they're not accurate reproductions of any known medieval instrument type. Instead, they incorporate features matching shadow song principles, asymmetric tone holes, unusual bore shapes, construction choices that prioritize psychoacoustic effects over conventional acoustic efficiency. Were the Vogels deliberately preserving guild knowledge, passing techniques from master to apprentice under the cover of historical interest? Or did they independently rediscover principles through their own experimentation? Family records, examined with the team's new understanding, suggest deliberate preservation. Letters between family members use phrases like the old tradition, the forgotten harmonies, the work that must continue. In 1782 Paris, a salon hosted by the Comte de Saint-Germain, a mysterious figure who claimed to be centuries old and to possess alchemical secrets, included demonstrations of experimental music described by attendees as unlike anything heard in conventional performance and producing states of consciousness beyond normal waking awareness. The demonstrations were framed as scientific curiosity, entertainment for sophisticated audiences, but descriptions of the instruments used match shadow song features. Each of these preservation threads represents someone who valued knowledge enough to risk ridicule, professional reputation, or worse. They didn't fully understand what they preserved. Each possessed pieces of a shattered tradition, fragments that hinted at something larger without revealing the complete system. But their efforts, scattered across centuries and geography, kept possibilities alive when authorities had tried to eliminate them completely. The instrument Maria discovered represents something different, not a fragment or coded reference, but a complete functional example. Someone didn't just preserve knowledge about these instruments, they preserved an actual instrument, hidden carefully enough to survive, but recoverable enough to eventually be found. That suggests intentionality, planning, a belief that future generations would need access to what their own time had rejected. The question becomes, who preserved it, and what did they know about when and how it should be revealed? The estate where Maria found the instrument belonged to the Schreiber family, minor Austrian nobility whose lineage traces back to medieval times, but whose prominence never rose above regional significance. They were comfortable rather than wealthy, educated rather than influential, the kind of family that history mostly overlooks, which makes their possession of the instrument all the more mysterious. Family records, scattered among various relatives after the estate's sale, gradually come together as researchers contact descendants and explain their interest. Old letters, journals, photographs, the accumulated documentation of lives that seemed ordinary until viewed through the lens of the shadow song mystery. One figure emerges as pivotal. Otto Schreiber, born 1851, died 1891, remembered by his family as the eccentric scholar who travelled extensively and returned changed. Otto's early life followed expected patterns for his class. University education in Vienna, focusing on history and classical languages. Brief military service, fulfilling aristocratic obligation. Marriage to a suitable woman from a similar family. Then, in 1882, something shifted. His letters to relatives begin referencing an obsession with medieval music history, specifically with traditions he believes were suppressed by church authorities. His travel journals reveal systematic investigation. He visits monasteries throughout Central Europe, always requesting access to manuscript collections, always asking about instruments or musical practices that might have been hidden or forgotten. He corresponds with scholars, dealers in antiquities, descendants of medieval craftsmen. Most think he's pursuing academic interest. Some recognize the intensity as something more. In one letter to his brother, Otto writes, "Everyone assumes medieval culture was primitive, superstitious, limited by ignorance. But evidence suggests they understood aspects of sound and consciousness that we've forgotten. Not primitive, sophisticated in ways we no longer recognize. I must find what survives." The journals document his progress, false leads, dead ends, occasional discoveries that fuel continued searching. He finds a manuscript with shadow song symbols in the margin. Interviews, an old instrument maker whose grandfather claimed to know the old ways, but died before fully sharing them. Purchases fragments of unusual instruments from dealers who don't recognize their significance. Then, in 1888, the journal entries become cryptic. Otto stops recording specific locations, instead using codes or vague references. He's found something he doesn't want documented clearly, perhaps fearing the wrong people might read his journal. The final entries before he returns to Austria permanently describe travelling to the place Vogel's letter indicated and meeting the last one who remembers. After 1889, Otto rarely leaves the family estate. Letters from relatives express concern about his health, his changed demeanour, his withdrawal from social life. His wife writes to her sister. Otto spends hours alone in the library, doors locked, claiming he's cataloguing family history. But sometimes I hear sounds through the door. Not music exactly, but something like music, and it makes me uneasy in ways I cannot explain. Otto's death in 1891, at age 40, surprised everyone. He'd been healthy, showed no signs of illness. The physician's official cause of death, heart failure. But the physician's private notes, discovered in a family archive, describe something else. Patient presented no physical signs of cardiac disease. Death appeared to result from extreme psychological shock or terror. Expression suggested he witnessed something profoundly disturbing in his final moments, though he was found alone in his locked study. Most peculiar case in my career. The trunk containing the instrument bears Otto's initials and sealing wax stamped with his personal mark. Inside, wrapped with the instrument, researchers find a single page in Otto's handwriting. "I have found what I sought. I understand now why it was hidden. I lack courage, or perhaps wisdom to use it as intended. I preserve it for those who come after, in hope that they possess what I lack. May God grant them better judgment than I claim for myself." Otto's story confirms the instrument's authenticity and suggests genuine danger, not superstitious fear, but something that affected even a skeptical, educated investigator profoundly enough to shatter his life. Modern neuroscience offers frameworks for understanding what medieval people interpreted as magic or spiritual experience. Dr. Aisha Patel, a cognitive neuroscientist studying auditory processing at Cambridge, examines the instrument recordings with sophisticated analysis tools unavailable to previous generations. What she discovers validates both medieval fears and contemporary caution about the instrument's effects. fMRI scans of listeners' volunteers who agreed to undergo brain imaging while hearing the instrument played show activation patterns unlike those produced by conventional music. Normal musical listening activates the auditory cortex, plus regions involved in memory, emotion, and reward. The shadow song instrument activates all of these, but also triggers significant activity in the default mode network brain regions. Normally active during rest, internal reflection, and self-referential thought. This activation pattern resembles what occurs during meditation, daydreaming, and certain psychedelic states. The default mode network is where consciousness processes self-awareness, constructs narratives about personal identity, imagines alternative scenarios. When this network activates during external sensory input, it creates a strange hybrid state, simultaneously receiving external information and generating internal experience, blurring boundaries between perception and imagination. More striking is what happens to brainwave synchronization. Human brains produce electrical oscillations at various frequencies: beta waves during alert focus, alpha waves during relaxation, theta waves during deep meditation or drowsiness, delta waves during sleep. These frequencies normally operate somewhat independently in different brain regions. But listeners to the shadow song instrument show unusual cross-frequency, coupling theta rhythms in the temporal lobes in training with alpha rhythms in the frontal cortex. This entrainment creates coherence across brain regions that normally communicate minimally. The result, subjectively, is what consciousness researchers call altered states. Experiences where normal perceptual boundaries dissolve, where time perception shifts, where awareness expands beyond its usual confines while remaining conscious and functional. The instrument's acoustic properties engineer these states mechanically. The beating patterns it produces, those interference waves between closely tuned frequencies, occur at 4 to 7 Hz, matching theta brainwave frequency. When the ear receives rhythmic input at specific frequencies, the brain tends to synchronize its own rhythms to match. This is frequency-following response, a well-documented phenomenon. But the shadow song instrument does something more sophisticated. Its overtone patterns create multiple simultaneous beating frequencies, establishing rhythmic relationships between different frequency bands. This produces nested entrainment, theta waves, syncing to one beat pattern, alpha waves to another, creating complex phase relationships that normal music doesn't achieve. Most remarkably, recordings reveal subsonic frequencies sound below 20 Hz, below conscious hearing threshold. These infrasonic components can't be heard, but they're felt as vibration, as pressure, as vague unease or unusual presence. Military researchers have studied infrasound because it affects people at subconscious levels, bypassing rational processing entirely. Dr. Patel emphasizes that none of this is supernatural. It's applied neuroscience sophisticated understanding of how sound affects brain function, encoded in instrument design. The medieval guild discovered through empirical observation what modern labs confirm through controlled experiments. They didn't have theoretical frameworks, but they had something equally valuable: centuries of careful experimentation, systematic documentation of which designs produced which effects, refinement across generations. This scientific validation reframes the Church's persecution. The Guild wasn't threatening religious doctrine through theological argument. They were threatening it through technology, providing alternative means of accessing transcendent experiences without requiring priestly intervention, sacramental authority, or doctrinal belief. That's not heresy, it's competition. And the Church responded accordingly, eliminating competitors and destroying their technology. The question remaining is whether these consciousness-altering effects are beneficial, neutral, or harmful. Science can measure what the instrument does to brains. It can't determine whether those effects serve human flourishing or endanger psychological stability. For that, we need to examine what happens to people who actually use it. One compelling interpretation of the Shadow Song Guild frames them as healers, practitioners of sophisticated music therapy, centuries before the modern medical establishment would recognize sound's therapeutic potential. Evidence supporting this interpretation accumulates as researchers examine guild activities from therapeutic rather than merely musical perspectives. Medieval medicine operated on the theory of humors, 4 bodily fluids that required balance for health. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile corresponded to temperaments: sanguine, phlegmatic, melancholic, choleric. Illness resulted from imbalance, treatment aimed at restoration. Standard approaches included bloodletting, herbal remedies, and dietary modification. But some practitioners believed sound could also adjust these balances. The concept originates with Pythagoras, who claimed specific musical modes affected different organs and emotional states. Medieval theorists inherited these beliefs, teaching that Dorian mode produced courage, Phrygian mode inspired contemplation, Lydian mode generated joy. But most medieval medicine treated these claims as theoretical rather than practical, interesting philosophy that didn't translate into actual therapeutic protocols. The Shadow Song Guild appears to have taken the theory seriously and developed it into systematic practice. Archaeological evidence from the Thuringia workshop suggests therapeutic application. The concentric circles on the floor would position patients at specific acoustic points, creating spatial arrangements where sound reached them with particular intensity or timing. Benches along the walls show wear patterns, suggesting people reclined rather than sat upright, positioning consistent with therapeutic treatment rather than musical performance. Botanical analysis provides additional evidence. The burned herb residues found in the workshop aren't random medieval plant materials. They're specific. Mugwort enhances dream recall and visionary experiences. Wormwood, in controlled doses, produces mild euphoria and heightened sensory perception. Mandrake has analgesic properties and facilitates dissociative states. These aren't recreational drug use. They're carefully selected compounds that would increase receptivity to sonic intervention. Cross-cultural parallels strengthen the therapeutic interpretation. Tibetan Buddhist practitioners use singing bowls to treat physical and psychological ailments, believing specific frequencies restore energetic balance. Australian Aboriginal healing traditions employ didgeridoo playing, with its continuous drone and overtone-rich timbre, to address spiritual and physical illness. Amazonian shamans use icaros, melodic patterns, sung during ayahuasca ceremonies, to guide healing journeys and address specific conditions. Modern sound therapy independently rediscovered principles the Shadow Song Guild apparently understood. Current practitioners use tuning forks, singing bowls, and electronic frequency generators to treat conditions ranging from anxiety to chronic pain. Research validates that specific sound frequencies affect physiological processes, reducing stress hormones, enhancing immune function, modulating pain perception, facilitating emotional release. Hospital records from medieval Vienna, examined with the team's new understanding, show intriguing patterns. Between 1,310 and 1,375, patient recovery rates varied significantly between hospitals. St. Leopold's Hospital, which employed shadow song practitioners as part of its treatment protocol, showed markedly better outcomes than similar institutions. Patients recovered faster from injuries, reported less pain, experienced fewer complications. After 1378, when the guild was eliminated, St. Leopold's recovery rates declined to match other hospitals. The change is statistically significant, suggesting the shadow song treatments provided measurable benefits beyond placebo effects or contemporary medical interventions. But what conditions were they treating? Guild records mention restoration of balance, harmonizing of troubled spirits, and correction of disordered humors, language that could describe almost anything. Modern therapeutic sound work suggests possibilities. Trauma release through neurological entrainment, pain management through endorphin release triggered by specific frequencies, anxiety reduction through parasympathetic nervous system activation, depression treatment through altered brainwave patterns that disrupt rumination cycles. The therapeutic interpretation explains why guild services were valued enough to command significant fees, why aristocratic patrons employed them, why their suppression provoked complaints from patients who'd benefited from treatment. It also explains church opposition not merely as theological concern, but as economic competition. The church operated hospitals, employed healers, claimed miraculous cures as evidence of divine favor. Shadow song practitioners providing effective alternatives threatened both revenue and religious authority. Whether healing was the guild's only purpose remains unclear. The ritualistic aspects of their practice, the spiritual language surrounding their work, the consciousness-altering effects documented by modern researchers, all of this suggests healing may have been one application of broader knowledge about sound, consciousness, and human potential. But the therapeutic evidence alone justifies considering the guild's elimination as medical suppression, not merely religious persecution. A more esoteric interpretation frames the Shadow Song Guild as consciousness explorers, systematic investigators of human awareness's full range, using sound as a vehicle for accessing psychological territories most people never visit. This interpretation treats their work not as healing or entertainment, but as deliberate research into consciousness itself. The evidence begins with the notation tablets found in the Thuringia workshop. Standard musical notation records pitches and durations, what notes to play, and how long to hold them. The Shadow Song tablets encode more complex information. Three-dimensional diagrams show pitch changes over time, but also include color coding that appears to indicate timbral qualities, and symbols surrounding notes that researchers struggle to interpret. One musicologist suggests the symbols might indicate emotional qualities, not emotions the music should evoke in listeners, but emotional states performers should embody while playing. Another researcher proposes they represent breathing patterns, instructions for coordinating sound production with respiratory cycles in ways that affect consciousness. A third interpretation treats them as navigational maps, guides for journeys through psychological spaces, with notes marking waypoints and transitions between distinct states of awareness. The notation includes repeated phrases like begin at the still point, ascend through 7 chambers, return before the threshold darkens. This isn't musical terminology. It's the language of inner exploration, similar to descriptions in mystical texts across traditions. Sufi mystics describe ascending through levels of consciousness toward divine union. Christian contemplatives reference stages of prayer leading to mystical marriage with God. Buddhist meditation texts outline jhana states, progressively refined levels of concentration and awareness. The Shadow Song Guild appears to have developed sonic technologies for reliably inducing these states. Not randomly, not through vague mysticism, but with precision and reproducibility. The notation provides instructions. Play these sequences, in this order, at these tempos, with these timbral qualities, and consciousness will shift in specific predictable ways. Modern practitioners of consciousness exploration recognize parallels. Psychonauts, explorers of psychological space, through meditation, sensory deprivation, or careful use of psychoactive compounds, report that certain sounds or rhythms reliably produce specific experiences. Overtone chanting creates sensations of spatial expansion. Binaural beats at particular frequencies induce states resembling meditative absorption. Rhythmic drumming facilitates journey experiences similar to shamanic soul flight. The Guild may have systematically mapped this territory, documenting which sonic patterns produced which consciousness shifts, building comprehensive cartography of inner space. The 7 concentric circles in their workshop take on new meaning, not arbitrary decoration, but representing 7 distinct states, 7 levels of depth, 7 chambers to traverse. Interviews with people who've listened extensively to the reconstructed instrument reveal consistent patterns in their reports. Initial listening produces relaxation and mild time distortion. Continued exposure leads to visual imagination, heightening closed-eye imagery, becoming vivid, almost hallucinatory in intensity. Deeper engagement facilitates experiences subjects describe as meeting something or encountering presence, not external entities but aspects of their own consciousness perceived as autonomous, capable of communication, possessing knowledge the conscious mind doesn't recognize having. These reports match descriptions from mystical literature: Sufis encountering the beloved, Christians meeting Christ in contemplation, Buddhists confronting the clear light. But they also match reports from psychedelic research, where participants frequently describe encountering autonomous entities, receiving information from aspects of consciousness experienced as other than self. The controversial possibility emerges that the Guild wasn't just altering brain chemistry or producing interesting subjective experiences. They may have been accessing genuine dimensions of consciousness territories as real as waking awareness, but normally excluded from it, accessible only through specific techniques and conditions. Sound was their key, the technology that unlocked doors most people don't know exist. This interpretation explains the Church's response with new clarity. If the Guild provided reliable methods for accessing transcendent experiences independently of religious framework, they threatened the entire edifice of institutional spirituality. Not through argument, but through technology, they could show people doorways rather than merely describe them. That's far more dangerous than heretical belief. That's offering experiential proof that alternatives to official reality exist. The Guild's suppression becomes tragic in this light, not merely the elimination of a craft tradition, but the loss of systematic knowledge about human consciousness's full potential. We're now rediscovering through expensive research programs what they apparently understood centuries ago: that consciousness is far more malleable, far more vast, far stranger than everyday waking awareness suggests. The instruments were tools for exploration, and their destruction left humanity with diminished maps of its own interior territories. Whether these explorations led anywhere beneficial remains debated. Some modern experimenters report profound personal growth, enhanced creativity, spiritual experiences they describe as life-transforming. Others report destabilizing encounters with psychological material they weren't prepared to face, consciousness alterations that proved difficult to integrate into normal life. Perhaps the Guild understood that exploration requires preparation, guidance, careful approach, wisdom lost when they were eliminated. Deep analysis of Guild materials reveals something more fundamental than techniques or applications. A comprehensive worldview, a cosmology where sound isn't incidental to reality, but constitutive of it. This philosophical framework explains not just what the Guild did, but why they believed their work mattered profoundly. The tablets encode a concept difficult to express in modern terms: reality as essentially vibrational. Not vibration as metaphor, but as literal description. Everything that exists vibrates at specific frequencies, and relationships between things derive from relationships between their vibrations. Harmony between vibrations produces affinity, coherence, what medieval thinkers called sympathy. Dissonance produces separation, conflict, what they termed antipathy. This isn't primitive animism or mystical speculation. It anticipates by centuries what quantum physics suggests. Matter is energy in patterns of vibration. Solid objects are mostly empty space where particles oscillate. Apparent separateness between things masks underlying interconnection through shared quantum fields. The Guild lacked mathematical formalism, but their intuitions were accurate. Their notation system doesn't just record pitches, it represents relationships between layers of reality. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual dimensions they understood as interpenetrating rather than separate. Each note connects to specific qualities: joy, courage, wisdom, compassion. Playing certain sequences allegedly moved energy between layers, explaining both healing effects and consciousness-altering properties. This cosmology parallels traditions worldwide. Hindu philosophy teaches Nada Brahma sound as divine essence, the fundamental creative force. Buddhist sutras describe emptiness vibrating into form, manifestation as oscillation between being and non-being. Indigenous cosmologies often frame creation as song, the world sung into existence by gods or ancestors. The Shadow Song Guild represents European expression of a nearly universal understanding that sound is fundamental to existence itself. Medieval European culture possessed this framework before the Enlightenment displaced it with mechanical materialism. Pre-Reformation Christianity emphasized mystical participation in divine reality. Hermetic philosophy, inherited from Egypt and Greece, taught correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm, between human consciousness and cosmic order. Alchemical traditions understood transformation as process affecting practitioner and materials simultaneously, not merely physical chemistry, but spiritual transmutation. The Guild operated within this holistic worldview. They weren't just making sounds, they were participating in reality's vibrational nature, learning to consciously manipulate resonance patterns, facilitating transformations that modern dualistic thinking struggles to conceive. Their instruments weren't tools separate from operators but extensions of intentionality, means of consciously engaging with fundamental forces. Protestant Reformation and Enlightenment rationalism systematically dismantled this framework. Protestants rejected mystical participation, emphasizing faith and scripture over direct experience. Enlightenment thinkers dismissed holistic cosmologies as superstition, replacing them with mechanical models where matter is inert, consciousness is epiphenomenal, and meaning is human projection onto meaningless mechanism. This paradigm shift was enormously productive in specific domains, enabling scientific revolution, technological development, systematic understanding of physical causation. But it also represented loss, abandonment of ways of knowing that didn't fit the new framework. The Guild's suppression represents a larger pattern: elimination of holistic, participatory worldviews in favor of detached, analytical ones. Whether their cosmology was true matters less than recognizing it was coherent, internally consistent, capable of generating practical applications that worked. Modern physics increasingly suggests reality may indeed be more vibrational, more interconnected, more consciousness-involving than Enlightenment materialism assumed. Quantum entanglement, observer effects, field theories all hint at a universe more like what the Guild described than what replaced their worldview. The final principle recovered from the tablets translates roughly as, "Sound does not describe reality, it is the means by which reality describes itself." This suggests something profound. Perhaps the Guild believed that by mastering sound, they were learning reality's own language, participating consciously in the ongoing creative process that manifests and sustains existence. That's not craft or art or even science in modern terms. That's something else entirely. A form of engaged wisdom we lack vocabulary to properly name because we abandoned the framework that made such understanding possible. The instruments are artifacts of a different way of being in the world, one that our culture eliminated in favor of approaches better suited to technological control, but perhaps less adequate to human flourishing. Since the instrument's reconstruction and Leora's initial performance, word has spread through networks that thrive on mystery and forgotten knowledge. Dozens of musicians, researchers, consciousness explorers, and simply curious individuals have requested access to the replica or recordings. What emerges is an unexpected modern community pursuing what the medieval Guild explored, creating a living laboratory where ancient technology meets contemporary understanding. Maya Chen, an electronic music producer from Singapore, works with recordings of the instrument in ways the Guild never imagined. She samples the sounds, layers them into ambient compositions designed for meditation and deep focus. Her tracks circulate on streaming platforms tagged for sleep and relaxation, accumulating millions of plays from listeners who have no idea they're hearing reconstructions of suppressed medieval technology. The comment sections fill with reports. "This helps me sleep better than anything else I've tried. I have the most vivid dreams when this plays. Time seems to stop when I listen, an hour feels like minutes." Maya herself reports that working with the sounds affects her differently than conventional audio. She spends hours in her studio, manipulating frequencies, adjusting overtone relationships, crafting sonic environments. She describes entering flow states deeper than anything her previous work produced, losing awareness of her body, feeling ideas arrive fully formed rather than requiring conscious construction. When she emerges from these sessions, often 5 or 6 hours have passed, though she's certain it's been perhaps 2. Dr. James Thornton, a trauma therapist in London, incorporates recordings into clinical sessions with clients suffering from PTSD and complex trauma. Standard talk therapy and EMDR had produced limited results with certain patients, their nervous systems too dysregulated, their defenses too rigid for conventional approaches to access traumatic material. But when he introduces the shadow song recordings, something shifts. Clients report memories surfacing with less emotional overwhelm, narrative details becoming clearer, insights emerging about patterns they'd struggled to recognize. One client, a combat veteran who'd been unable to process battlefield experiences through 3 years of therapy, listens to the recordings during a session, and suddenly begins speaking about events he'd never mentioned before. Not with the dissociation or emotional flooding that had characterized previous attempts, but with clarity and presence painful material accessed without re-traumatization. Dr. Thornton documents the session, noting that the sounds seem to create psychological conditions where consciousness can approach difficult content without triggering the protective mechanisms that normally wall it off. But not all encounters are therapeutic. A graduate student experimenting with extended listening sessions, 3 hours daily for 2 weeks, reports progressively disturbing experiences. Visual distortions begin appearing in normal waking awareness. Sounds develop echoes they shouldn't have. She feels observed, as if something is watching from just outside her peripheral vision. The symptoms persist for weeks after she stops listening, requiring psychiatric intervention and anxiolytic medication. Another experimenter, a meditation teacher with decades of practice, describes his experience in terms that trouble the research team. He listens to the recordings during deep meditation and reports encountering what he describes as an entity within the sound, not metaphorically but actually present, autonomous, possessing intelligence and intention. He describes this entity as neither benevolent nor malevolent, but profoundly alien, operating according to logic incompatible with human understanding. The encounter leaves him shaken, questioning assumptions about reality he'd considered settled. 3 separate participants, never in contact with each other, working independently in different countries, report encountering the same figure during deep listening sessions. They describe him as the musician who never stopped playing, a presence that feels ancient, patient, waiting for something. When shown historical illustrations and asked to identify similar figures, all three independently point to the same medieval manuscript illumination, a robed figure holding an unusual wind instrument, drawn in the margin of a 13th century text about divine harmony. The research team compiles these reports, attempting to categorize experiences into explicable effects and genuinely anomalous phenomena, but the boundary keeps shifting. What initially seems clearly psychological, auditory hallucinations, dissociative episodes, imaginative elaboration, begins to show patterns suggesting something more structured, more consistent across subjects than individual brain chemistry would predict. The instrument's effects appear to be both neurological and phenomenological, affecting both measurable brain states and subjective experiences in ways that resist simple materialist explanation. As data accumulates from modern experiments, a clear pattern emerges. The instrument affects different people differently, sometimes dramatically so. What produces profound altered states in one listener creates barely noticeable effects in another. This variability isn't random. It correlates with specific factors that suggest individual differences in receptivity, possibly explaining why medieval guilds restricted their practices to trained members rather than making them publicly accessible. Musicians with extensive training show heightened responses, but not all musicians equally. Those familiar with Western classical tradition, trained in precise pitch, standardized technique, formal theory, often report minimal effects beyond aesthetic appreciation. But musicians experienced with non-Western traditions show dramatically different responses. Indian classical musicians trained in raga, Middle Eastern musicians familiar with maqam, Indonesian gamelan players, those whose ears have developed sensitivity to microtonality, complex rhythmic cycles, and overtone-rich timbres consistently report more intense experiences. Regular meditation practitioners form another group showing enhanced receptivity. Whether they practice Buddhist vipassana, Hindu mantra repetition, Christian contemplative prayer, or secular mindfulness, those with disciplined meditation experience report the instrument's effects as more pronounced, easier to sustain, and more navigable than meditation-naive listeners describe. It's as if meditation training develops psychological muscles that can engage productively with the consciousness states the instrument facilitates. Conversely, analytical listeners show diminished receptivity. Music theorists, sound engineers, acoustic researchers, those trained to focus attention on technical parameters rather than subjective experience, consistently report weaker effects. Their listening style appears to block the very mechanisms through which the instrument operates. Focused analytical attention, it seems, prevents the diffuse awareness required for the instrument's psychoacoustic properties to affect consciousness significantly. Dr. Tanaka's brain imaging studies reveal structural correlates to these experiential differences. Individual variations in auditory cortex organization predict response intensity. Some people's brains process overtones more prominently than fundamental frequencies, creating perceptual experience richer in the timbral complexity where the instrument's effects concentrate. Others' brains filter overtones as noise, attending primarily to fundamental pitches, effectively deaf to dimensions of sound where the instrument's consciousness-altering properties operate. Personality factors matter too. Psychological testing shows that absorption, the tendency toward immersive experiences, losing self-awareness in activities, correlates strongly with response intensity. People high in absorption describe the instrument's effects as overwhelming, transporting, impossible to ignore. People low in absorption report it as pleasant background sound, interesting but not compelling. Openness to experience, one of the big five personality dimensions, also predicts receptivity. Those high in openness, curious, imaginative, willing to question assumptions, enter altered states more readily and describe them more elaborately. Those low in openness, practical, conventional, preferring familiar experiences report minimal effects or actively resist the states the instrument facilitates. These findings raise profound questions about the nature of receptivity itself. Is it fixed and innate neurological variation people are born with, or can it be cultivated through practice? The medieval guild clearly believed in cultivation, investing years in training apprentices. They wouldn't have bothered if receptivity were purely innate. But modern evidence suggests both factors operate. Some people possess natural sensitivity that makes training easier, while others can develop receptivity through disciplined practice, even without natural advantage. This understanding reframes the guild's selective practices. Perhaps they weren't hoarding knowledge or maintaining elitist exclusivity. Perhaps they recognized that these technologies require preparation, that exposing unprepared individuals to powerful consciousness-altering experiences serves neither the individual nor the tradition. Like contemplative traditions worldwide that impose initiation periods and graduated training, the guild may have understood that transformation requires readiness, that readiness develops over time, and that rushing the process endangers everyone involved. The question becomes whether modern society, with its demand for immediate access and democratic distribution, can responsibly integrate technologies that apparently require extensive preparation to use safely and effectively. A growing movement seeks to integrate shadow song insights into contemporary practice responsibly. Not as historical recreation, treating the guild's work as museum curiosity, but as living tradition adapted to modern contexts, informed by both ancient wisdom and current scientific understanding. The challenge is finding a path between democratization and gatekeeping, between sharing knowledge freely and protecting people from experiences they're unprepared to navigate. The Institute for Applied Acoustics in Copenhagen develops therapeutic protocols, incorporating the instrument's psychoacoustic principles. Rather than using the original design directly, they create modified instruments and electronic soundscapes that employ similar beating patterns, overtone relationships, and frequency combinations. Their approach is cautious, medicalized, involving thorough screening, informed consent, preparation sessions, integration support. Early clinical trials show promise. Treatment-resistant depression cases where multiple medications and therapy approaches have failed responds to 6-week protocols combining guided listening with integration therapy. 73% of participants show clinically significant improvement, with many achieving full remission. The mechanism appears to involve disrupting rumination patterns through altered brainwave states, allowing patients to access more flexible thinking about their situations and themselves. Chronic pain patients report reduction in pain intensity and interference with daily life. The sounds don't eliminate pain, but change relationship to it, creating psychological distance that makes it more manageable. One patient describes it as, "The pain is still there, but I'm no longer trapped inside it. There's space around it now." PTSD treatment shows particularly striking results. Combat veterans, abuse survivors, accident victims, people whose nervous systems remain locked in threat response years after objective danger has passed, describe the listening sessions as creating conditions where they can finally process traumatic memories without being overwhelmed. It's as if the sounds establish a container strong enough to hold difficult material safely. But therapeutic applications represent only one dimension of contemporary integration. Composer collectives experiment with incorporating the instrument into new music that honors its acoustic properties while creating genuinely contemporary art. They're not recreating medieval music or attempting historical authenticity. They're discovering what's possible when ancient psychoacoustic understanding informs modern compositional practice. Educational programs emerge, teaching musicians about frequency relationships, beating patterns, overtone manipulation, not as abstract theory, but as practical tools for crafting emotionally and neurologically impactful music. The goal isn't just creating pleasant sounds, but understanding how to consciously shape listener consciousness through acoustic design. These integration efforts provoke fierce debate within the emerging shadow song community. Some argue all knowledge should be freely available, that restricting access recreates the same gatekeeping that led to the guild's suppression. Others contend that psychological safety requires graduated training, that certain experiences can destabilize unprepared individuals, that wisdom sometimes means saying not yet rather than never. A middle path develops, freely sharing information about principles and history, while providing structured training for those wanting deeper engagement. Similar to martial arts belt systems or clinical psychology's supervised practice requirements, this approach creates pathways for serious students without blocking casual interest or academic study. The model attracts criticism from both sides. Advocates of complete openness view any restriction as elitism. Proponents of stricter gatekeeping worry that insufficient screening will lead to psychological casualties. But the middle path persists because it seems to work, allowing integration while minimizing harm, honoring tradition while adapting to contemporary contexts. What's emerging isn't recreation of medieval practice, but something new. A tradition informed by ancient wisdom, validated by modern science, adapted to 21st century needs and understanding. The instruments themselves are less important than the principles they embody. Knowledge about sound's capacity to affect consciousness, insight into human awareness's malleability, wisdom about the care required when exploring consciousness's further territories. The question isn't whether this knowledge should exist in the modern world. It exists now, and that can't be reversed. The question is how to integrate it responsibly, learning from both the guild's sophistication and from the consequences of their forced disappearance. Perhaps what was lost 8 centuries ago isn't being recovered, but being reimagined, transformed into something that serves contemporary needs while respecting its mysterious origins. Understanding what the Shadow Song Guild represented requires stepping back from specific techniques or instruments to consider the larger question. What happens to a culture when an entire dimension of knowledge is violently erased? The Guild's elimination wasn't merely craft tradition ending. It was systematic removal of an entire approach to sound, consciousness, and human potential. Consider what medieval Europe lost in 1378. Not just instruments or musical compositions, those are replaceable, even if it takes centuries. What disappeared was accumulated understanding. Generations of observation about how specific sounds affect human psychology, extensive experimentation, mapping relationships between acoustic properties and consciousness states, refined techniques for using sound therapeutically and transformatively. This knowledge represented perhaps 2 centuries of systematic exploration, thousands of hours of careful practice, insights discovered and documented across multiple generations. But deeper than technique was philosophical framework, the cosmology that made their work meaningful. The Guild understood reality as fundamentally vibrational, saw sound as primary rather than secondary phenomenon, recognized consciousness as malleable and exploratory rather than fixed and bounded. This worldview enabled possibilities that materialist frameworks exclude by definition. When the Guild was destroyed, Europe didn't just lose craft knowledge. It lost an entire way of being in relationship with sound, consciousness, and reality itself. The loss is similar to what happens when indigenous languages disappear, not merely words vanishing, but conceptual frameworks, ways of categorizing experience, insights embedded in linguistic structure that translation can't fully preserve. Modern European culture inherited the consequences of this loss. We treat sound as information carrier, entertainment, or ambient background, rarely as technology for consciousness transformation. Our music education emphasizes technical proficiency, historical knowledge, aesthetic appreciation, seldom exploring sound's capacity to induce altered states or facilitate psychological healing. We've developed sophisticated audio engineering, but limited understanding of psychoacoustic applications beyond marketing and entertainment. The contrast with cultures that maintained continuous contemplative traditions is striking. Tibetan Buddhist practitioners still use sound systematically for consciousness transformation. Indian classical music retains frameworks connecting specific ragas to psychological and spiritual effects. Indigenous traditions worldwide preserve sound-based healing practices. These cultures didn't experience the systematic suppression that fractured European knowledge, so their traditions evolved continuously, adapting while maintaining core understanding. What Europe gained through the Enlightenment was enormous scientific method, technological development, systematic rational inquiry. But gains came at cost. The same analytical approach that enabled scientific revolution required rejecting holistic frameworks, mystical participation, and consciousness-centered epistemologies. We built powerful tools for understanding objective physical reality, but lost equally sophisticated tools for navigating subjective psychological reality. The Guild's elimination marks a turning point, where European culture chose or had chosen for it one set of possibilities while closing off others. Not consciously, not through democratic deliberation, but through institutional power deciding which knowledge was permissible and which threatened established authority. Modern rediscovery of the shadow song tradition creates opportunity to reconsider that historical decision. Not to romanticize medieval practices or reject scientific understanding, but to ask whether we can integrate what was lost with what was gained. Can we embrace both rigorous materialist science and sophisticated consciousness exploration? Can we value both technological control of physical environment and skillful navigation of psychological territory? The instrument represents more than historical curiosity. It's a portal not in supernatural sense, but in offering access to ways of knowing that our culture largely abandoned. Working with it means confronting questions about consciousness, reality, and human potential that Enlightenment rationalism tried to settle, but perhaps prematurely foreclosed. What was lost wasn't primitive or superseded knowledge. It was sophisticated understanding that took different questions seriously, that investigated territories scientific materialism declares non-existent or illusory. The loss diminished human culture's breadth, narrowed our collective sense of what's possible, created blind spots that persist despite our technological sophistication. Recovery doesn't mean recreating medieval practices exactly. It means learning from them, allowing their insights to inform contemporary understanding, discovering what becomes possible when we integrate rather than choosing one knowledge system exclusively. The Guild can't be restored, but perhaps something new can emerge, synthesis honoring both what was lost and what was gained, creating approaches richer than either ancestor alone. As the research team attempts to document their findings for academic publication and public dissemination, they encounter an unexpected problem. The very act of documentation seems to diminish what's being documented. The instrument's effects resist capture through conventional academic language, and attempts to standardize or systematize the experiences fundamentally alter their character. Dr. Richter writes draft after draft of her formal analysis, each version feeling progressively more inadequate. The technical acoustic data is straightforward frequency measurements, overtone relationships, brainwave entrainment patterns. But the experiential dimension, what actually happens to consciousness during listening, refuses neat categorization. Subjective reports use wildly divergent metaphors. Some describe spatial expansion, others temporal distortion. Still others report synesthetic blending of sensory modalities. How do you write a scientific paper about phenomena that each person experiences and describes differently? The problem mirrors difficulties that plague consciousness research generally. You can measure neural correlates, which brain regions activate, what neurotransmitters release, but measuring doesn't equal explaining. First-person experience remains irreducible to third-person data. The felt quality of altered states, what philosophers call qualia, exists in a dimension objective measurement can't fully capture. Documentary filmmakers attempting to create a visual record face similar challenges. How do you show sound's effects through images? They film listeners' faces, hoping expressions reveal inner experiences. They use abstract animation representing frequency patterns, creating visual metaphors for acoustic phenomena. They interview participants, capturing testimonies that inevitably feel inadequate to the experiences being described. The resulting documentary is beautiful, compelling, but everyone involved knows it's not conveying what actually matters. It's pointing towards something that must be directly experienced to be understood. This documentation paradox was perhaps one reason the Guild relied on experiential transmission rather than written texts. You can't learn to navigate altered states by reading about them any more than you can learn to swim by studying physics. The knowledge is embodied, requiring direct practice under guidance from someone who's already developed the capacity. Written records serve as reminders for practitioners, not instruction manuals for beginners. But modern academic culture demands textual documentation. Knowledge that exists only in practice, transmitted only through apprenticeship, doesn't count as proper knowledge in institutional frameworks. It's dismissed as mere technique, craft rather than understanding, practical rather than theoretical. The Guild's work threatens to be dismissed again not through persecution, but through inability to satisfy documentation standards that aren't designed for experiential knowledge. Some team members argue they shouldn't try forcing the work into academic formats. Instead, they should create experiential opportunities workshops where interested people can directly engage with the instruments and sounds, developing their own understanding through practice. Knowledge would spread through networks of practitioners rather than academic publications, more like martial arts or meditation traditions than conventional scholarship. Others worry that approach would ghettoize the findings, keeping them marginal to mainstream academic conversation. If the work isn't published in peer-reviewed journals, it won't influence neuroscience, psychology, or musicology. It'll remain curiosity for enthusiasts, rather than challenging established frameworks. The debate reflects a larger tension about knowledge systems and authority. Who decides what counts as legitimate knowledge? How do experiential traditions interface with academic institutions? Can there be middle ground between ivory tower scholarship and entirely practice-based transmission? The team eventually publishes in multiple formats simultaneously. Conventional academic papers for scientific journals, a popular book for general readers, documentary films for visual learners, and most importantly, experiential workshops for those seeking direct engagement. Each format has limitations, but together they create multiple access points for different audiences with different learning styles and interests. The paradox remains. The most important aspects of their discoveries resist documentation entirely. The instrument's deepest effects happen in spaces where words don't reach, where consciousness touches territories that language can't map. That doesn't make them unreal or unimportant. It makes them profoundly human experiences that define our inner lives but exceed our capacity to fully communicate them to others. 3 years after the instrument's initial discovery, the research team gathers to discuss what they've learned and what remains mysterious. Despite extensive investigation, sophisticated analysis, and numerous experiments, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Perhaps more importantly, new questions have emerged that nobody thought to ask at the beginning. Helena opens the discussion by acknowledging something that's become increasingly clear. They're not going to solve this mystery completely. The instrument's origins, the guild's full intentions, the actual scope of their knowledge, all of this remains partially opaque, obscured by time and deliberate suppression. But incomplete understanding doesn't mean the investigation failed. Sometimes the right questions matter more than definitive answers. Marcus raises a question that's troubled him increasingly. Why now? Why did this particular instrument survive to be discovered in 2019? Hundreds must have been built over the guild's 2-century existence. All were apparently destroyed or lost except this one. Probability suggests nothing should have survived. Yet here it is, emerging at a historical moment when technology exists to analyze it properly, when cultural openness to alternative consciousness states has increased, when people are searching for exactly what it represents. Is that coincidence? Or was Otto's preservation intentional, timed somehow for future discovery? The question sounds like conspiratorial thinking, yet the evidence is difficult to dismiss. Otto's final letter suggested he was preserving the instrument for those who come after, implying he believed future generations would need or want it. Did he intuit that knowledge suppressed in the 14th century would become relevant again in the 21st? Or is the team falling into pattern recognition, seeing intention where only chance operates? Dr. Patel raises a different concern. What responsibility do they have regarding dissemination? They've documented that the instrument produces measurable effects, both beneficial and potentially destabilizing. Some people report healing, insight, creative breakthroughs. Others report psychological disturbance, disturbing encounters, effects that took months to integrate. Given this mixed evidence, what's their ethical obligation? Should they work to make the knowledge more accessible or less? Should they advocate for regulation, or would that recreate the same gatekeeping that destroyed the guild? Leora notes that the instrument itself seems to select participants. Not literally, not magically, but practically. It attracts people already inclined toward consciousness exploration, already prepared through meditation or artistic practice, already possessing psychological resilience. Casual listeners find it interesting but not compelling. Those who become deeply engaged tend to be people with preparation, intentionality, existing contemplative practice. Perhaps the instrument's effects naturally create appropriate gatekeeping without requiring institutional enforcement. The discussion circles without resolving, which feels appropriate. The shadow song tradition wasn't destroyed because it provided clear answers. It was destroyed because it raised questions authorities found threatening. Recovering the tradition means recovering comfort with uncertainty, with mystery, with knowledge that resists complete systematization. What they've documented over 3 years of research is simultaneously less and more than they expected. Less because definitive explanations remain elusive, because key aspects resist measurement and categorization, because the deepest effects happen in territories where scientific instruments can't follow. More because they've confirmed the existence of a sophisticated medieval tradition that challenges assumptions about historical knowledge, validated that ancient wisdom sometimes exceeds modern understanding, demonstrated that consciousness is stranger and more malleable than materialist frameworks acknowledge. The instrument continues to attract interest, generate controversy, facilitate experiences both transformative and troubling. It exists now in the world again, available to those who seek it, mysterious to those who encounter it. Perhaps that's exactly what Otto intended when he sealed it in that trunk, not to provide answers, but to ensure the questions remained alive, waiting for a time when people were ready to ask them again. Throughout the investigation, one question has persisted beneath all others. How did medieval craftspeople, working without modern acoustic theory or neuroscience, develop such sophisticated understanding of sound's effects on consciousness? The standard historical narrative suggests the past was primitive, that knowledge progresses linearly, that ancient peoples knew less than we do about everything. The Shadow Song Guild challenges that comfortable assumption. Evidence suggests they discovered through systematic observation what modern science confirms through controlled experimentation. They didn't need frequency analyzers to recognize that certain sounds reliably produced specific effects. They didn't need fMRI machines to document that some acoustic patterns altered consciousness predictably. They had something equally valuable: time, patience, and careful attention across generations. Consider how traditional knowledge develops in any domain. Master craftspeople develop intuitions that exceed what they can articulate hands, knowing things minds can't explain. Wine experts distinguish subtle flavor differences without understanding the chemistry. Navigators wayfind across oceans using star patterns and wave observations without formal mathematical models. Knowledge doesn't require theoretical framework to be sophisticated or effective. The Guild apparently operated through what we might call empirical mysticism, systematic experimentation, grounded in direct experience rather than abstract theory. They built instruments, tested them, observed effects, refined designs based on results. Over generations, successful innovations accumulated while failures were discarded. The result was technology that worked without requiring its creators to understand why in modern scientific terms. This approach parallels how shamanic traditions worldwide developed psychoactive plant knowledge. Indigenous practitioners didn't need biochemistry to discover which plants produce which effects, which combinations enhance or dangerous, which preparation methods optimize desired outcomes. They experimented, remembered, transmitted successful protocols, and accumulated pharmacological knowledge that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. But there's another possibility that some researchers consider, though carefully, aware it sounds speculative. Perhaps the Guild inherited knowledge rather than discovering it entirely through their own efforts. Medieval Europe existed in continuity with earlier cultures: Roman, Greek, Egyptian, and beyond. Each civilization had its own understanding of sound and consciousness. Perhaps what seems like medieval innovation was actually preservation and adaptation of older wisdom. Pythagorean teachings about music's power originated in 6th century BCE Greece, but drew on even older Egyptian sources. Orphic mysteries used music ritually. Dionysian cults employed drums and flutes to induce ecstatic states. These traditions didn't disappear when Christianity became dominant. They went underground, preserved by those who valued their insights regardless of official prohibition. The symbols carved on the instrument match no known alphabet, but they show structural similarities to Hermetic sigils, alchemical notation, and symbols from mystery school traditions. Perhaps they represent a visual language transmitted across centuries through initiatory lineages, encoding knowledge that couldn't be openly taught but was too valuable to lose. This possibility that the Guild preserved ancient wisdom rather than independently discovering it doesn't diminish their achievement. Preservation across centuries of persecution and cultural transformation requires tremendous dedication. Adaptation of ancient techniques to medieval contexts requires sophisticated understanding. Whether they discovered or inherited their knowledge, they clearly mastered it, refined it, and developed applications that served their communities until authorities decided such knowledge was too dangerous to permit. The question of how they knew what they knew remains ultimately unanswerable with available evidence. But asking it reveals assumptions about history, knowledge, and human capability that perhaps deserve questioning. We assume progress is linear, that understanding always increases, that past peoples were less sophisticated than present ones. But evidence from multiple domains suggests reality is more complex. Knowledge is sometimes lost, then rediscovered. Wisdom appears in unexpected places, and understanding isn't distributed uniformly across time or culture. The Guild represents a particular flowering of knowledge about sound and consciousness, neither the beginning nor the end of that lineage, but a crucial middle chapter. Their destruction didn't eliminate the knowledge entirely, as modern rediscovery demonstrates. Perhaps it can't be eliminated because it's ultimately knowledge about human nature itself, and human nature doesn't fundamentally change across centuries. The capacities the Guild developed and applied sound's ability to alter awareness. Consciousness's malleability under specific conditions remain latent in all humans, waiting for appropriate circumstances to manifest again. As documentation concludes and the team prepares final publications, a strange pattern emerges in how people engage with their work. Those who encounter the story of the Shadow Song Guild often report experiences eerily similar to those reported by people who actually hear the instrument, as if the narrative itself carries some of the properties it describes. The mystery becomes recursive, folding back on itself. Readers of early draft articles describe becoming obsessed with the story, thinking about it constantly, dreaming about the instrument despite never having heard it. Podcast listeners report time distortion while listening to episodes about the research 40-minute episodes feeling like they pass in moments. Documentary film audiences sometimes enter light trance states during viewing, particularly during segments featuring the instrument's acoustic analysis. Is this simply power of narrative good storytelling, creating absorption and engagement? Or is something stranger happening, where discussing the instrument's effects somehow transmits those effects even without direct acoustic exposure? The team debates this carefully, aware of sounding grandiose or making claims they can't support. One researcher proposes that knowledge about consciousness-altering practices can itself be consciousness-altering. Reading about meditation affects how you think even before you meditate. Learning that sound can induce trance makes you more receptive to those effects when you encounter them. Perhaps documenting the Shadow Song tradition activates in readers the same capacities the instrument was designed to access, not as strongly, not as directly, but subtly, enough to color experience and perception. This recursive quality appears in the Guild's original materials too. The notation tablets don't just record music, they record experiences. The symbols encode not only which notes to play, but what states of consciousness those notes facilitate. Perhaps that encoding affects even people who encounter the symbols without playing the corresponding sounds, creating contact with the states through representation rather than direct sonic induction. The idea resonates with concepts from multiple traditions. Tibetan sacred art is considered to transmit blessing even in reproduction. Islamic calligraphy transforms religious texts into visual meditation objects. Aboriginal songlines encode geographical and spiritual information in patterns that affect consciousness even when sung silently. Perhaps the Shadow Song materials operate similarly, not merely describing reality but participating in it, affecting those who encounter them through mechanisms that exceed conventional information transfer. This possibility troubles the materialist researchers who want clear causal mechanisms and testable hypotheses. But it fascinates those comfortable with ambiguity, who recognize that consciousness does strange things, that belief and expectation affect experience profoundly, that the boundary between really happening and psychologically constructed isn't as clear as everyday language suggests. The recursive mystery extends to the instrument's destruction and preservation. The Church tried to eliminate the tradition, but their documentation of that elimination preserved knowledge that enabled modern reconstruction. Otto sealed the instrument to protect it, but that preservation ensured its eventual discovery. Every attempt to suppress or contain the knowledge seems to facilitate its transmission, as if the tradition possesses agency, not literal consciousness, but something like cultural momentum that moves through human intentions toward its own continuation. Perhaps this is simply how robust knowledge traditions work. They adapt, find new channels, exploit whatever opportunities history provides for continuation. Or perhaps there's something specific to the shadow song tradition, some quality of the knowledge itself that makes it particularly resistant to suppression, particularly good at finding new forms and contexts for expression. The team can't answer these questions definitively, but raising them feels important, acknowledging that 3 years of investigation has deepened mystery rather than eliminating it. That understanding has grown while uncertainty has grown alongside it. The investigation formally concludes, but the story doesn't end. If anything, it's accelerating, branching into trajectories the original team never anticipated. The instrument has become a focal point for converging interests: academic research, artistic exploration, therapeutic application, spiritual seeking, simple curiosity about what was lost and why. New instruments are being built, not exact replicas but inspired variations. Craftspeople worldwide are experimenting with the principles the Guild encoded, discovering how to apply them using contemporary materials and techniques. Electronic musicians are creating digital instruments that employ the same psychoacoustic effects through software rather than wood and air. The tradition is evolving again, adapting to 21st century contexts while maintaining core understanding. Academic programs are incorporating findings into curricula. Music therapy students study the historical precedents and modern applications. Neuroscience courses use the instrument as case study in auditory processing and brainwave entrainment. Medieval history classes examine it as evidence of sophisticated technical knowledge in periods we typically underestimate. The Guild's work is entering mainstream scholarly discourse, no longer marginal curiosity, but recognized contribution to understanding human history and capability. Most significantly, communities are forming people who've been affected by encountering the instrument or its story, who recognize kindred spirits in others who've had similar experiences. They gather online and in person, sharing observations, comparing effects, developing contemporary practices informed by Guild principles but adapted to modern life. They're not recreating medieval ceremonies but discovering what 21st century shadow song practice might look like. This emergent community includes musicians and meditators, therapists and artists, academics and seekers. It's not organized hierarchically, no governing body, no official leadership, no standardized protocols. Instead, it operates through networks, with knowledge and practices spreading organically through personal connection and shared experimentation. This decentralized structure may be its greatest strength, making it resistant to the kind of institutional suppression that eliminated the original Guild. The instrument itself continues revealing new properties. Researchers discover additional acoustic features they initially overlooked. Players develop techniques for producing effects the original team didn't anticipate. The technology isn't static, fully understood, completely mapped. It remains generative, continuing to teach those who work with it seriously. Perhaps most remarkable is how the discovery has affected those directly involved. Helena speaks of her worldview transforming, certainties she held for decades, becoming questions she now finds more interesting than answers. Marcus describes developing sensitivity to sound and consciousness he never possessed before, as if studying the instrument cultivated capacities it was designed to affect. Leora continues playing it occasionally, each encounter revealing new dimensions she hadn't perceived previously, as if the instrument changes or she changes, or their relationship evolves across time. They all acknowledge that what began as academic investigation became something more personal, more transformative than they anticipated. You can't study consciousness alteration at this depth without being altered yourself. You can't investigate suppressed knowledge without questioning the assumptions that structured your own education. You can't encounter genuine mystery without being marked by it. The sound continues, rippling outward through time and culture, affecting each generation differently according to its needs and readiness. What the Guild created 8 centuries ago is alive again, not as historical recreation, but as living tradition, still teaching, still transforming, still revealing that human consciousness is stranger and more malleable than we typically acknowledge. After years of investigation, extensive research, sophisticated analysis, and countless hours of experiential exploration, certain questions remain unanswered. Not because the team failed to investigate thoroughly enough, but because some aspects of the Shadow Song tradition resist complete explanation. This isn't failure. It's recognition that mystery is sometimes irreducible, that not everything can or should be fully known. The deepest question persists. What exactly did Guild members experience in those hidden chambers, playing their instruments within ritualistic contexts that no modern researcher has fully reconstructed? The team has acoustic data, neuroscience findings, contemporary reports from people who've worked with replicas. But none of this quite captures what happened when master practitioners, trained across decades, played authentic instruments in ceremonies designed over generations to optimize specific effects. The notation tablets hint at experiences modern experimenters haven't achieved states described in language, suggesting consciousness expanding beyond individual boundaries, accessing knowledge from sources practitioners couldn't identify, encountering autonomous entities or dimensions of reality consensus awareness excludes. Are these descriptions metaphorical, poetic representations of psychological states, or were Guild members genuinely accessing something that materialist frameworks don't acknowledge? The team can't answer definitively. Brain scans show unusual activation patterns, but don't explain subjective experience. Reports from modern practitioners sometimes parallel Guild descriptions but lack the systematization and confidence that extensive training apparently provided. It's like trying to understand advanced meditation states. By interviewing beginners, the direction is similar, but the depth is incomparable. This unknowability extends to the Guild's ultimate purposes. Were they primarily healers, consciousness explorers, spiritual practitioners, or something else entirely? Probably all of these, but weighted in ways that remain opaque. Medieval guilds often combined practical craft with philosophical and spiritual dimensions we struggle to understand from modern secular perspectives. The Shadow Song practitioners may have integrated functions we artificially separate: healing and spiritual growth, music and medicine, art and transformation. Why the Church feared them so intensely also remains partially mysterious. Yes, they threatened institutional monopoly on transcendent experience. Yes, they operated outside ecclesiastical control. But the intensity of suppression, the systematic coordination, the thoroughness of elimination, the apparent desperation to erase all traces, suggests authorities perceived danger exceeding mere competition. What did they know or suspect about the Guild's work that made complete elimination seem necessary? Perhaps the Guild discovered, or was transmitting knowledge truly incompatible with Christian cosmology, not just through theological disagreement, but through providing experiential evidence contradicting church claims. Perhaps their practices enabled states of consciousness where conventional reality structures dissolved, revealing something authorities found genuinely threatening to social order. Or perhaps the persecution was ultimately about power, and theological justifications were convenient framing for eliminating competitors. The instrument's preservation by Otto raises final unknowable. Did he understand something about timing, about when this knowledge should re-emerge? His death under mysterious circumstances, his cryptic final letter, the care with which he sealed the instrument, all suggest intention beyond simple historical preservation. But what he knew or experienced remains his secret. These unknowables don't frustrate the research team, as they might have initially. They've come to appreciate mystery as valuable in itself, as essential element of the work. The Shadow Song tradition isn't puzzle to be solved, but territory to be explored, and genuine territories always contain regions that resist complete mapping. That's not failure of cartography, but recognition that reality exceeds human capacity for total comprehension. The unknowable aspects create space for continued engagement, ongoing exploration, future discoveries. If everything were fully explained, interest would fade. Mystery sustains attention, invites participation, ensures the tradition remains alive rather than becoming dead historical artifact. What remains unknowable keeps the investigation active, the questions vital, the tradition evolving rather than calcifying into fixed doctrine. Perhaps that's the Guild's final gift. Not just instruments and techniques, but modelling a relationship with knowledge that honours mystery, that recognises understanding and uncertainty as complementary rather than contradictory, that finds wisdom in questions that resist definitive answers. The shadow song tradition now exists in the world again, accessible to those who seek it but not imposed on those who don't. This creates an interesting situation. Knowledge that was suppressed has been recovered, but what happens next isn't predetermined. The tradition's future depends on how people engage with it, what they discover through practice, how contemporary culture integrates or resists insights it offers. For those who've never heard the instrument or encountered this history, an invitation exists. Not to believe uncritically, not to accept claims without investigation, but to consider possibilities that mainstream culture typically dismisses. Human consciousness may be stranger, more malleable, more vast than everyday experience suggests. Sound may affect awareness in ways that go beyond entertainment or emotional manipulation. Ancient peoples may have possessed sophisticated knowledge we've only begun to recover. This invitation doesn't require abandoning scientific skepticism or embracing mystical worldviews uncritically. It asks for openness, willingness to engage with experiences that challenge assumptions, to suspend judgment long enough to explore directly, rather than dismissing based on prior beliefs, to recognize that materialism is philosophical framework rather than proven fact. For musicians, the tradition offers new territories to explore, not just historical techniques to master, but principles that can inform contemporary practice. How might understanding psychoacoustic effects transform composition? What becomes possible when you approach music not just as aesthetic expression, but as technology for affecting consciousness? These aren't merely academic questions, but invitations to practical experimentation. For therapists and healers, the Guild's work provides historical precedent and contemporary validation for sound-based interventions. Modern sound therapy is often dismissed as New Age pseudoscience, lacking historical grounding or theoretical framework. But evidence suggests sophisticated sound healing traditions existed in medieval Europe, were systematically practiced, produced measurable results. That doesn't prove any specific modern protocol works, but it shifts conversation about possibilities. For spiritual seekers, the tradition offers what it apparently offered medieval practitioners: methods for exploring consciousness that don't require adherence to particular religious frameworks. The instruments affect awareness through acoustic properties, not through belief or doctrinal commitment. They work across cultures, religions, worldviews, accessible to anyone willing to engage seriously, regardless of their metaphysical assumptions. For historians and scholars, the discovery challenges assumptions about medieval culture, technical sophistication in pre-modern periods, and relationships between knowledge and institutional power. It provides case study in how sophisticated traditions can be eliminated so thoroughly that centuries later their existence is doubted, how power determines which knowledge survives and which disappears. For everyone, the tradition raises questions worth contemplating. What is consciousness, really? How much of what we consider fixed reality is actually malleable, subject to alteration through accessible techniques? What knowledge has been lost because it threatened powerful institutions? What might we rediscover if we look beyond official narratives to forgotten alternatives? The invitation isn't to any specific belief or practice, but to curiosity, to willingness to investigate rather than assume, to openness about human potential that contemporary materialism often forecloses. The instrument exists. The effects are documentable. The history is recoverable. What you make of all this, whether you engage or dismiss, explore or ignore, depends on your own interests, needs, and readiness. The Guild can't be restored exactly. 8 centuries of lost continuity, changed cultural contexts, and modern understanding all mean contemporary engagement will differ from medieval practice. But something can emerge that honors the Guild's insights while serving 21st century needs. That emergence requires participation, people willing to explore seriously what this recovered tradition offers. The invitation stands. What happens next remains open. The instrument sits now in climate-controlled storage, the original preserved, the replica available for research and experimentation. Its physical location is known, its properties mapped, its effects documented. But in another sense, the instrument isn't anywhere specific. It's become idea, possibility, invitation, circulating through culture, affecting people who've never seen it or heard it played. Stories have that quality. They exist both as specific artifacts, books on shelves, recordings in archives, documentaries streaming online, and as living forces that move through minds and conversations, transforming with each retelling while maintaining essential character. The Shadow Song story is both historical investigation and unfolding narrative, both completed research project and continuing exploration. What the Guild created wasn't finished when they were suppressed in 1378. It continued in fragments, in underground preservation, in independent rediscoveries across centuries. It continues now in contemporary experiments, in new instruments inspired by old principles, in communities forming around shared interest in sound and consciousness. The melody the Guild began plays still, though transformed by time and circumstance, adapted to new contexts, while maintaining core themes. Perhaps that's what traditions are: not fixed doctrines or unchanging practices, but living processes that flow through time, manifesting differently in each era according to needs and possibilities present. The Shadow Song tradition isn't a static thing to be preserved exactly as it was. It's a dynamic process, continually becoming, shaped by those who engage with it while shaping them in return. The team's investigation ends, but the story doesn't. New researchers will ask different questions, make discoveries the original team missed, develop applications nobody has yet imagined. The instrument will continue teaching those who approach it seriously, revealing new properties to each generation, adapting to serve needs that change even as core human nature remains constant. What began in a dusty Austrian attic ripples outward still. Maria found one instrument, but that discovery triggered wider recovery manuscript searches, revealing Guild history, workshop excavations, uncovering techniques, contemporary experiments validating effects, communities forming to explore implications. One thread pulled, and entire tapestries began emerging from historical shadows. The title, The Forgotten Melody, proves somewhat inaccurate. The melody wasn't forgotten completely, couldn't be, because it encodes something essential about human consciousness, about sound's power, about potentials that remain latent until circumstances call them forth. It was suppressed, driven underground, fragmented across scattered preservations. But forgotten? Perhaps forgetting isn't possible for knowledge this fundamental, this rooted in human nature itself. What remains is ongoing invitation. The sounds that medieval guilds carefully crafted, that authorities feared enough to eliminate, that individuals risked persecution to preserve, those sounds exist again, accessible again, affecting consciousness again. Whether this represents recovery of lost wisdom or dangerous resurrection of suppressed practices remains open question, answered differently by each person who encounters the tradition according to their own understanding and experience. The melody continues, unfinished because it's designed to be unfinished, because its purpose isn't entertainment, but transformation, not performance, but participation. It plays in hidden chambers and modern studios, in historical archives and contemporary concerts, in scientific laboratories and contemplative practices. It plays most significantly in spaces between past and present, between knowledge and mystery, between what we know and what we're still discovering about ourselves.